Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been working as a forest ranger near Pinewood Springs, Colorado, since mid-2022. My job mostly involves showing folks safe camping spots and making sure no one wanders into restricted areas. The terrain around here can be tricky, but normally it's peaceful work. I never expected something like what happened that afternoon, and to be honest, it still keeps me up at night. It started with a call from a frantic man claiming his brother had vanished on one of the trails. It wasn't the first time I'd heard someone say a companion got lost, but his tone made me immediately uneasy. He mentioned that his brother had stopped to admire the view, and when he turned around, the guy was just gone. It all seemed too sudden to be a normal disappearance. I hopped on one of our four-wheelers and raced out to the spot he described. The area itself wasn't particularly treacherous, just a fairly dense section of forest, leading toward a rocky outcrop. The man was pacing when I arrived, clearly distraught. He told me he'd already searched nearby trees, small hills, and any potential hidden paths, but he'd found no trace of his brother. I took a few moments to look around myself, checking for footprints or any sign of recent disturbance in the brush, but the ground was weirdly undisturbed, almost like no one had walked there in days. The man then mentioned seeing a narrow opening in the rock, some kind of cave or tunnel entrance. I've been in that area before and never noticed any significant caves, but I'm always open to the possibility of a hidden crevice. He led me to the base of the mountain, near a cluster of jagged boulders. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, just slabs of stone piled in a natural formation. Then, as I walked closer, I caught sight of a shadowy recess. The opening was almost camouflaged by the surrounding rock. Honestly, if he hadn't pointed it out, I doubt I would have noticed it. That's how well it blended in. A chill crept up my spine the moment I stepped near the entrance. The air felt colder, and there was an odd smell, something musty, but not like damp dirt. It reminded me of old metal, though there was no obvious source for it. I shined my flashlight inside and saw what looked like a tunnel stretching farther into darkness. It sloped downward slightly, but I couldn't tell how deep it went. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was like my body was telling me to back off, to not go in there alone. I told the man we should return to the ranger station for backup. No cave in this region was listed in our records, and exploring unknown caverns can be dangerous for a bunch of reasons. Collapses, hidden sinkholes, wild animals, you name it. He seemed anxious, but reluctantly agreed. We were about to step away when, out of nowhere, the man bolted into the cave. It was so fast, so sudden, like something inside him snapped. One moment he was standing next to me, the next he was sprinting into the darkness without a single word. I screamed his name. I only got it because of the form he filled out earlier, but he was gone. I hesitated, took a few steps in, but some voice in my head told me if I followed him, I might never get out. My flashlight was shaking in my hand, and my palms were clammy. Everything about that cave felt wrong. I made the decision to head back and radio our search team. Adrenaline was rushing through me as I sped toward the station. Within an hour, we had a small team assembled with ropes, proper lighting, and emergency gear. We retraced my path exactly, marking all the key landmarks I remembered. But when we arrived at the spot, there was just solid rock. No crack, no recess, nothing to indicate there had ever been an opening. My heart sank. I felt insane. I double-checked the ridge of stones, the arrangement of trees, the exact angles. Yet it was completely sealed. My co-workers tried to reassure me that maybe I'd just mistaken the location, but I knew this was the right spot. I recognized the unique shape of the boulders, even the little cluster of pine trees to the left. Still, there was no sign of the cave. We set up a perimeter and began a thorough search of the area. Helicopter support arrived within a couple of hours. They scanned the region with thermal imaging and other tools, but nothing indicated any hollow spaces or tunnels. As the daylight started to fade, I felt this mounting sense of dread. It was the same atmosphere that gripped me when I first saw that hidden entrance. Even the search dogs acted strangely. They sniffed around, but never led us anywhere significant. We scanned every inch of that mountainside until it was too dark to continue safely. The missing man's presence was nowhere to be found, and I couldn't help but think about his last expression as he darted inside that void. There had been a kind of desperation, or maybe compulsion on his face. For the next few days, I returned to that spot every chance I got. I combed the area for any sign of cracking rock or a hidden passage that might appear in certain lights. But everything looked so ordinary that it was maddening. My colleagues were supportive, at least at first, but as time went on, they seemed to chalk the incident up to some kind of error or hallucination. They said maybe the missing man found another route and got lost deeper in the forest. But I knew what I had seen. That opening was real, and it wasn't just a gap in some bushes. It was a structured tunnel leading inside the mountain. The official records list the man as missing, with the last known location somewhere along that trail. Family members came by, posted flyers, asked questions I couldn't begin to answer. I repeated what I knew. He ran into a cave, and we couldn't find it again. It sounds ridiculous even to my own ears, like something you'd see in a paranormal documentary. But I can't deny the coldness I felt when I stood in front of that entrance, or how it had vanished as if it never existed. My background in environmental science tells me there must be a logical explanation. Maybe a rock slide sealed it. Maybe an illusion of shadows tricked my eyes. Maybe there was some hidden trapdoor effect caused by shifting layers of stone. But none of that explains how the man's brother vanished so instantly, or why I felt that overwhelming sense of dread. I keep replaying the events of that day in my head. It happened so quickly, but also felt strangely drawn out, like time slowed down in those key moments. Sometimes I dream about that cave, and I'm standing right at the threshold, shining my flashlight inside, but the beam never touches anything. It's just this endless darkness. I still work in the park, still guiding visitors and cautioning them about staying on marked trails. But every time I see people approach those rugged rocks, I get this tightness in my chest. I remind them to stick to the main path, to avoid venturing anywhere unfamiliar. I don't tell them the real reason. I doubt anyone would believe me. But I can't shake the fear that somewhere in that tangle of cliffs and pines, there's a hidden place that shouldn't exist, a place that's claimed at least one life. To this day, no one has found the missing man or his brother. That entire situation just ended the same day it began, leaving only questions behind. There's never been another call about a sudden cave popping up, but I remain on edge, always worried someone else might slip away into that darkness. Whenever I pass by that section of the park, I feel this nagging certainty that something is there, lurking just beyond what my eyes can see. And I'll never forget how, for one horrifying afternoon, I was certain it was real. Story 2. I remember it was late 2019 when I decided to take that night hike near Elmsford in Vermont. I'd heard the trails were peaceful, and I was looking for something different. Just me, the woods, and the moonlight. I arrived at the trailhead around 9 at night, and the parking lot was dead empty. No other cars, no people, nothing. The second I turned off my headlights, total darkness wrapped around me, except for the pale glow of the moon filtering through the tall trees. It felt like every shadow was alive, watching my every move. At first, I thought I was just being jumpy. I do night hikes sometimes, and I like the slight rush of exploring in the dark. But something was different this time. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I started feeling this weird sense that someone else was there, like a prickling at the back of my neck. I sat there in my car for a good minute or two, trying to brush it off and telling myself I was imagining things. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Right then, I happened to glance up toward this small rocky ridge just ahead. At first I thought it was just a dark tree trunk poking up, but it looked oddly shaped. Then it moved, just a little, like it shifted its weight from one side to the other. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. It was tall, definitely taller than an average person, and the shape seemed too lean or elongated to be a regular hiker. For a few seconds, we both just stayed there, me in my car, and that silhouette looming above on the ridge. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a person standing up there, maybe they were out for a stroll or a night climb, but something felt off. There weren't any other cars in the lot, and that thing's posture looked unnatural, completely still, yet somehow ready to bolt. I couldn't see any details, but the outline itself gave me the creeps. Then, like an idiot, I decided to switch on my headlights to see it better. The second my headlights swept across that ridge, the figure recoiled and disappeared behind some rocks, almost without a sound. It moved too fast, faster than I'd expect a normal person to move on rough, uneven ground. It was like a jolt of dark motion, there 1 second and gone the next. I can't explain why, but a wave of cold fear shot right through me. My mind was already racing with worst-case scenarios. Maybe it was an animal, but it seemed too big for that. Maybe some weirdo lurking around, but who stands on a ridge in pitch-black darkness? I'm usually not one to spook so easily, but I could barely breathe. My gut screamed that sticking around to find out what that thing was would be a huge mistake. I decided to back out, literally. I reversed my car, keeping my eyes on that ridge the whole time, expecting the figure to pop out again. For a few moments, I saw nothing but shadows. Then I caught a glimpse of movement, almost like a flicker of motion deeper in the woods, and that was enough for me. I floored it out of there. Driving back to Elmsford felt surreal. I kept checking my mirrors, half convinced I'd see something sprinting behind me under the moonlight. All I could hear was my heartbeat thumping in my ears. By the time I reached the small hotel where I was staying, my hands were shaking. I tried explaining it to the night receptionist, and they casually suggested it might have been a deer or even a bear. But I knew that silhouette wasn't any regular animal. It stood upright, and it behaved too aware. It was like it didn't want me to see it clearly. I've replayed that moment in my head countless times since then. Friends have come up with their own theories, saying it might have been a prank or some odd ritual thing. I've even wondered if I was just overly tired and seeing shapes in the dark. But deep down, I know I saw something. The way it reacted to the headlights, pulling back so quickly, felt almost calculated. It was as if it was determined not to be identified. That experience completely changed how I approach nighttime adventures. I still love the quiet and the thrill of hiking at night, but now I never go alone, and I always carry more gear than I need. I still can't shake the memory of that figure silently perched up on the rocks, watching me. It never made a sound, and it didn't need to. The feeling of being watched was enough. And the strangest part, after that one moment of seeing it dart away, I never saw it again. It was like it vanished into the darkness, leaving me with a racing heart and 1,000 questions I can't answer to this day. That night still gives me chills whenever I think about it, and I doubt I'll ever truly understand what I saw out there. I just know I'm not too eager to wander alone in the dark anymore. Sometimes the things we can't explain are the ones that stay with us the longest. Story 3. Back in 2017, I worked as a ranger at a state park near Silver Lake in Indiana. It wasn't the busiest place, but I liked that it stayed quieter than most parks. One evening, I got multiple reports about loud, eerie noises coming from the northeastern section. Visitors described sounds like screams that almost seemed human, yet somehow wrong, like an animal screech, but pitched oddly. I was used to odd calls about nighttime noises, but there was something in the urgency of those reports that got under my skin. It felt different. That same night, my co-worker Frank and I decided to head out there. We'd done plenty of after-dark checks before. Usually we ended up scaring off raccoons or smaller predators, so I wasn't expecting anything too unusual. Still, I couldn't shake a weird feeling in my stomach. Frank had been with the park for longer than me and told me not to overthink it, but I could see he looked uneasy too. We drove the park's utility vehicle as close as we could, then continued on foot, heading toward the northeastern trails. Right from the start, something felt off. Normally, even at night, you hear crickets, maybe frogs near the water, the rustling of small creatures in the bushes. But the entire area was like a vacuum. No insects chirping, no wind through the branches, just absolute silence. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As we walked, I radioed Frank every few minutes, just wanting to confirm he was still around and okay. The path was only partially lit by our flashlights, and we kept looking around, trying to figure out if something was lurking in the dark. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack from somewhere in the brush, like a heavy branch snapping under a lot of weight. I froze, and Frank did too. It definitely didn't sound like a small animal. I pointed my flashlight around, but all I caught were leaves and shadows. We pushed forward, stepping carefully, and that's when I heard this rapid, shuffling noise. It reminded me of footsteps, except they had a very uneven rhythm. It wasn't simply left, right, left, right. It was more like something stepping sideways, then forward, then sideways again, if that makes sense. My adrenaline spiked, but curiosity pushed me onward. Frank was now moving slower than usual, which told me he felt that same anxiety crawling up his spine. We eventually reached the area where we'd gotten most of the strange noise reports. The place was unusually clear of wildlife tracks, which was bizarre. No raccoon prints, no deer hoof marks, nothing. I ran my flashlight over the ground, trying to find any sign of recent activity, but it was almost like the place had been wiped clean. The air felt heavy, and it smelled damp, but not like fresh soil, more like stagnant water. Hard to explain, but it made me uneasy. Then, out of nowhere, we both heard this loud exhale, almost like someone was trying to catch their breath really close to us. We spun around, aimed our flashlights in the direction of the noise, but saw nothing. A few branches rustled, and I swear something moved just beyond the beam of my light. The bushes shook, and I heard footsteps again. They circled around us, so we kept turning to try and spot what was making the noise. Our flashlights hit nothing but leaves and darkness. The sound of snapping twigs let us know it was there, though, and it was fast. We decided to backtrack. The tension was overwhelming, and we didn't want to be caught in the middle of who knows what. As we headed toward our vehicle, my heart felt like it was thumping in my ears, and the silence around us only intensified it. I couldn't even hear Frank's footsteps anymore. It was as if we were moving through some sound-deadening bubble. The only noises were those odd cracks and shuffles out in the darkness. Right before we reached the vehicle, we heard the scream. It was so loud and so jarring that I swear it vibrated in my chest. It sounded like a person wailing in agony, but the pitch was off. It went too high and then too low, like it broke midway through. In that moment, I just froze. My brain didn't know how to process a sound that seemed halfway human, but also not. It echoed over the silent trees, then abruptly stopped, leaving my ears ringing. Frank and I practically jumped into the car, locked the doors, and drove out of there, adrenaline pumping. Back at the ranger station, we reported every detail. The strange footsteps, the heavy breathing, that unearthly scream. I found out another security team had run into similar occurrences a few days prior. They'd even had a lantern knocked over by something they never saw. Some believed it was a large predator, like a black bear or maybe a cougar, though sightings are very rare in Indiana. Others whispered about cryptids or undiscovered animals. Nobody had real proof. The higher-ups didn't want to shut the park down, so they just restricted some trails at night. Frank and I got assigned to keep patrolling that northeastern area. Each time we went back, we heard weird snapping sounds and odd breathing noises. Once, I caught sight of a tall silhouette darting between the trees, too quick to make out any features. The next moment, it was gone. We never stayed out too long after dark anymore. It felt like we were being watched. Eventually, after a few weeks of these encounters, the bizarre sounds just stopped. No more reported screams, no more heavy footsteps. It was like whatever was out there moved on or decided to vanish. Officially, nothing was ever found. Some rangers found partial tracks that didn't match the paws of any local animals, but they were too incomplete to identify. In time, people stopped talking about it. The park went back to its usual routine, and I tried to put it all behind me. But I'll never forget that night. The memory of standing in the darkness, hearing that slow, circling shuffle, and then that scream, it still sends shivers down my spine. I wish I had a big reveal or some explanation that ties it all together, but I don't. It ended as suddenly as it started, leaving me with nothing but a lingering sense of dread and the knowledge that nature has secrets we don't always understand. Even now, whenever I find myself near Silver Lake after sunset, I feel that tension in the air. I don't know if it was an animal, something else, or just my nerves playing tricks. But if you ever visit that side of the park at night and hear footsteps in the silence, just remember, you might not be alone out there. Story 4. I still remember that day in 1986 like it happened yesterday. We were driving through the outskirts of Millfield, Ohio, my parents in the front, me and my little sister in the back, just soaking in the scenery on a quiet, winding road. My dad always preferred these hidden routes to the usual highways, so it wasn't unusual for us to see wide open fields and barely any other cars. But that day felt a bit different from the start, like the air was heavier or something. I shrugged it off at first, thinking it was just my imagination. Not long after we passed a small patch of forest, I noticed movement in a field on my right. At first, I thought it was a big dog or maybe a bear, but it stood so tall, way taller than any bear I'd seen at the zoo, that my stomach dropped. When I finally realized it was standing on 2 legs, I blurted out, "Are you guys seeing this?" My dad immediately slowed down and pulled over onto the grassy shoulder, like he'd spotted it too. And that freaked me out more because he usually brushed off any strange sightings, saying it was my overactive imagination. This time, though, he seemed rattled. I leaned forward between the front seats to get a better look. The creature's fur was dark brown, almost black in some spots, and it had a strangely upright posture, not hunched like a bear, but more like a person in a thick fur coat. It moved in a steady, determined way, not running exactly, but sort of gliding through the tall grass. When it turned its head, I swear I felt my blood run cold. There was an intelligence in the way it looked at us, like it was as curious about us as we were about it. For a second, none of us spoke. My dad's knuckles went white on the steering wheel, and my mom just covered her mouth with her hand. Then my sister whispered, "What is that?" And that seemed to break the spell. Dad opened his door and stepped out, telling us to stay put. But I was too curious. I cracked my door open and got out too, even though I was practically shaking. The creature paused. It was maybe 100 yards away, but it was huge, definitely over 7 feet tall. My dad's about 6 feet, and this thing would have dwarfed him. It looked our way like it couldn't decide whether to run or keep watching us. There was this odd moment where I felt almost connected to it, like we were intruding on its home turf, and it was deciding if we were a threat. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it thudding in my ears. Then, without warning, it just turned and started walking away, moving deeper into the field. I couldn't help but notice how effortless its stride was, nothing like the clumsy gait of a bear. My dad motioned for me to stay close as we walked a bit into the field, trying to see where it went. The grass was up to my waist, and every little rustle made me jump. My mother and sister stayed near the car, and I heard my sister calling our names, her voice trembling. I think she was scared we'd provoke that thing if we got too close. But curiosity pushed us forward. We found a small clearing where the grass was flattened in a rough path, which led us to these enormous footprints in the mud. Each print looked almost like a human foot, but wider and longer than anything humanly possible. My dad tried placing his boot next to one print, and it was dwarfed. He muttered something under his breath. He wouldn't admit it then, but I think he was genuinely terrified. A chill ran down my spine as I realized whatever left those footprints could easily overpower us. My dad, who used to mock TV shows about monsters in the woods, suddenly had no words. We both stood there, staring at the tracks, feeling like we'd intruded on something beyond our comprehension. After a minute of just standing in stunned silence, we heard my mom yelling. She had gotten out of the car and was pointing toward the tree line at the far end of the field. I saw the creature's silhouette disappear behind the trees, still walking upright. There were no other cars on the road, no other people around. It felt like we were alone in some weird alternate reality. We decided to head back to the car, but our eyes kept scanning the tree line, half hoping and half dreading we'd see it again. My dad tried to stay calm, but his voice shook a little when he told me to get in. Once we were all inside, he started the engine and turned the car around, wanting to find some place to gather our thoughts. We drove to a small gas station a few miles down the road. The clerk there asked if we were lost, and my dad said something vague about seeing a strange animal in the fields. The clerk kind of laughed it off and said something about folks around Millfield loving a good tall tale. We just nodded, not really wanting to argue. I mean, how do you even begin to explain what we saw? After we left the gas station, we parked again, and my parents quietly discussed going back to get a better look, or maybe call someone. But the whole thing felt too unreal, and we didn't want to look like fools chasing a myth. My mom kept saying she felt uneasy, like the creature could still be out there watching us. I was torn. I wanted to know what it was, but I also couldn't shake this creeping sense of dread. Eventually, we drove back toward the field. It was later in the day by then, the sun heading toward the horizon, painting everything in a golden haze. We didn't see the creature again, but just being near that spot made me feel jumpy, like it could appear at any second. The footprints were still there in the mud, though, and that was enough to remind me we hadn't imagined anything. We lingered for maybe half an hour, scanning the fields and the tree line, hearts pounding at every rustle of wind in the grass. But nothing else showed up. The air felt eerily still, like even the birds had gone silent. Finally, my dad said we should go. It was getting dark, and my mom looked like she was on the verge of a breakdown. I remember the drive back was almost completely silent. We were all too stunned to talk. To this day, we can't fully explain what we saw. My parents rarely bring it up anymore, and my sister just says she'd rather forget about it. But I still get chills thinking about those huge footprints and the way that creature moved, like it was both startled and strangely curious about us. Sometimes, I wonder if it was watching us from the trees as we stood there, clueless and vulnerable in the middle of that field. I haven't seen anything like it since, and part of me hopes I never do. Yet, Every time I pass through a remote area, I can't help but glance at the tree line, half expecting something huge and hairy to be peering back at me. I'm not here to convince anyone. I'm just sharing what happened. We all saw it, plain as day. Was it a Bigfoot, a bear with a weird posture, a person in a suit? I couldn't tell you. All I know is that I felt a fear I'd never felt before, and I can still picture that massive shape fading into the Ohio countryside like it never existed. After that day, I realized there are some things out there we may never understand, and maybe that's for the best. I've stopped trying to explain it, but I'll never forget it. It happened, and then it was just gone. Sometimes that's all there is to it. Story 5. I still remember that late summer afternoon in 1978 like it happened yesterday. I was out in the fields near Strawberry in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, helping 2 other men bale hay. The air was hot and still. We were just about to wrap up for the day when we heard these shrill screams coming from the direction of a nearby farmhouse. At first, I thought maybe someone had an accident or needed medical help, but the sound was so off, like the person was more animal than human. We stopped what we were doing and looked across the field. That's when we saw this figure sprinting toward us, flailing his arms wildly, yelling something none of us could make out. From far away, it looked like he was wearing normal clothes, but the closer he got, the more I noticed how ragged they were, practically torn to shreds. And there was something else too. His arms and legs seemed covered in thick, dark hair, way more than any normal person. It was like he was part man, part beast. I started feeling uneasy the moment I caught a glimpse of his face. It wasn't like anything I'd seen before. It had human features, but his jawline and cheekbones looked somehow elongated, almost lupine, if that makes sense. I tried telling myself maybe it was just a trick of the light or the angle I was seeing him from. But then he got close enough that all 3 of us could see the same exact thing, and none of us could believe our eyes. He was babbling in this guttural, broken sort of speech. No real words, just strange sounds. And the smell, God, that stench still haunts me. It was a mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I can't pinpoint. We actually stepped back, just because it was so overpowering. One of my buddies tried asking him if he was hurt, but this man-beast didn't respond. He didn't even look at us properly. His eyes seemed to be rolling up toward the sky, like he was fixated on something high above us that we couldn't see. At this point, none of us knew what to do. We were in a small community without any real medical facilities nearby. We weren't sure if this guy was dangerous or sick, or both. The way he kept twitching and gesturing made him look completely disoriented, almost like he was on the verge of collapsing. Next thing I know, he dropped down suddenly onto the grass, sitting there and rocking back and forth, making these bizarre noises. My heart was racing, and I could see the other 2 men were just as freaked out as I was. We thought maybe we should get someone older and wiser to handle this. So one of the guys waved over an elderly woman who happened to be walking near the farmhouse. It felt like the logical thing to do. Maybe she'd know who this person was or how to calm him down. But the second the old lady started approaching, the man's whole demeanor changed. He got up as if someone had set him on fire, and he sprinted off toward an old barn that was behind the farmhouse. We followed him, half out of concern, half out of sheer panic and curiosity. As he was running, I swear on my life, he started fading somehow. At first, it looked like the late afternoon sun was playing tricks on us, like he was entering a shadow. But then I realized he was becoming translucent, like literally disappearing right in front of us. I've never seen anything like that before or since. By the time he reached the barn doors, it was like his body was there 1 second and gone the next. We ran inside that barn, but he was nowhere to be found. It was just empty. Dust motes in the light, a few stacked bales of hay, and not a soul in sight. For a few seconds, none of us said a word. I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. One of the men, he was the oldest among us, just started praying under his breath. I remember looking around, sniffing the air, hoping to pick up that same awful stench we'd smelled earlier, but it was gone. It was like he had never even been there. All three of us stood there in shock until the elderly woman caught up to us, asking what had happened. We tried to explain, but how do you tell someone you just saw a creature man vanish into thin air? Word got around town fast. Some people said we must have seen a wild man who lived in the woods, maybe sick or mentally ill. Others thought we were making it up or exaggerating, but we all knew what we saw and what we smelled. That odor was so real, and the way he just disappeared. I've gone over it in my head 1,000 times, trying to come up with a normal explanation. Did he slip out a hidden door? Was there some tunnel under the barn floor? But it all felt impossible. The memory of watching him fade away right in front of my eyes still gives me chills. The three of us tried to go back to work that day, but it was useless. None of us could focus. The rest of the evening was a blur. I remember just wanting to get home, lock the doors, and pretend nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake this feeling of being watched. Even now, when I think about it, I feel uneasy. It's like a part of me is still standing there in that barn doorway, hearing the echo of that man's garbled screams and smelling that rancid odor. In the days and weeks that followed, rumors spread, and everyone came up with their own theory. Everything from demons to aliens to a poor soul with a rare condition. But the truth is, none of it explains how he faded into thin air, or why his face looked so animal-like. I've run through countless possibilities in my head, and after all these years, I'm no closer to the truth. Every so often, I'll revisit the area, thinking maybe I'll find some clue, but there's never anything. Just old farmland, the same barn, and memories I wish I could forget. I'm still rattled by the whole thing. You'd think time would dull the terror, but it hasn't. It comes back to me in waves, late at night when the house is quiet. I can see him again, crouched on the grass, looking at the sky like he was seeing something out of this world. That face, that smell. And then that moment he vanished, leaving us completely stunned. Even now, I don't have a neat explanation, and I doubt I ever will. Over the years, I've talked to a few people around Strawberry who claim to have heard about that hairy man or saw odd footprints in the woods. Maybe it's all tied together, or maybe they're just local legends feeding off each other. All I know is what I witnessed that day. It was real, it was horrifying, and it still burned into my memory. The fact that none of us ever saw him again, and he just disappeared into that barn without a trace, makes it even more unnerving. Sometimes I wish it had all been in my head, or some weird optical illusion caused by heat stroke or stress, but it wasn't. I was there, and I know exactly what I saw. And every time I think back to that day, I get that same knot of dread in my stomach, that same tight feeling in my chest. It's like my body remembers the fear before my brain can even catch up. After all these years, I have no answers, just that unsettling memory. And I guess that's how it's going to stay. I can still see his frantic eyes and hear those strangled noises he made. It happened, then it was over, just like that. No explanation, no real closure. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that whatever I saw wasn't supposed to be there, and that maybe, just maybe, we weren't supposed to see it at all. Story 6. I remember that morning in 2010 like it was yesterday. I woke up before sunrise, grabbed my gear, and drove out to check the traps I had set for coyotes near Huntington, Oklahoma. It was just me, my pickup, and the open fields. The weather was cold and still, the kind that makes you pull your jacket tighter and keep your eyes wide open. I'd done this routine 100 times before, but that day everything felt off from the start. When I reached the spot, I noticed something was wrong right away. One of my traps was practically demolished. The chain was stretched tight and twisted, and the stakes I had pounded deep into the ground were yanked clean out. Now I've seen strong animals get caught and thrash around, but never anything that could rip the stakes out like they were loose nails. I walked closer and felt my stomach twist. There were prints in the mud, huge prints, bigger than any wolf or coyote or even a large dog. At first I leaned in, thinking maybe some black bear had wandered through. But we don't get them that big around here, and the shape was all wrong. The marks looked almost like an oversized, elongated hand pressed into the ground, with long, spaced-out digits. It made my skin crawl. I used my glove to compare size, and whatever made that imprint dwarfed my hand by a mile. I tried to keep calm, but a shiver crawled up my spine. I remember thinking, what the heck could have done this? The area around the trap was torn to pieces. Clumps of dirt and grass were piled up, like something had been in a furious struggle. Then I heard the sound that still haunts me sometimes at night. It was this sudden, piercing roar, part growl, part high-pitched screech that echoed across the field. It was loud enough to make my chest vibrate and turn my insides cold. I froze. My mouth went dry and every hair on my neck stood up. I glanced around, heart pounding, trying to see if something was out there. But the fields were still, just that chill in the air and my shaky breath. For a second, I considered investigating further, but then my senses kicked in. If that thing was still nearby, I didn't want to be anywhere close to it without some backup. I hurried back to my truck and scrambled inside. My hands were shaking, and I could barely get the keys into the ignition. Right when I tried turning the engine, I heard a sound, like metal scraping on metal, from the rear of the truck. It was so distinct that I instinctively ducked down, as if that would protect me. My mind started going 100 miles an hour. Something was out there, messing with the tailgate or the side panel. I couldn't see anything in the rearview mirror except my own terrified eyes. Then came a deep, guttural snarl that made me break into a cold sweat. It sounded like it was right behind me, maybe just inches away from the back window. I didn't dare look. I just kept cranking the ignition, heart pounding so hard I thought it would explode. After what felt like an eternity, the engine finally roared to life. I gunned it, kicking up gravel as I sped off. I remember my shoulders were so tense I could barely move my neck. As I pulled away, I forced myself to glance in the side mirror. That's when I saw something. A tall, dark silhouette, standing on two legs, maybe 30 yards behind the truck. It looked bulky, with a shape that was vaguely canine but far too large, and the arms, or front limbs, hung in a strange way, almost like a person's. It didn't chase me. It just stood there, as if letting me escape. I caught just a second or two of that form before the road curved, and I lost sight of it. I can't even describe the wave of relief and dread that crashed over me. I was safe in the truck, but what had I just seen? I sped over to my friend's place, a guy who also messed with traps in the area. I showed up sweating, breathing hard, probably looking like I'd seen a ghost. I told him about the prints, the snarl, and the shape I saw. I could tell he was freaked out by how rattled I was. That's when he mentioned these old stories folks used to share about some giant dogman roaming the woods, mostly legends told by old-timers. I'd heard random tales over the years, but I never took them seriously. Suddenly, those stories felt a whole lot more real. We decided we'd head back to my trap site before the day was over, just to see if we could find more evidence or at least confirm what I'd seen. A part of me wanted to let it go, but curiosity, and maybe some twisted sense of duty, pushed us to check it out. We drove out in his pickup and parked about 20 yards away from where my trap had been. The sun was higher now, and everything seemed calmer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. We walked around the area, boots crunching on the dry grass, scanning every inch for tracks. That's when my friend spotted a bizarre mark on a nearby tree. Deep scratch marks, spaced out like claw slashes, higher up than my shoulder level. It definitely wasn't from a standard predator. It looked more like something that could stand upright and rake its claws across the bark. We didn't stay much longer. After seeing those scratches, we both felt exposed. The wind rustled through the trees, and every little noise made us jump. We carefully loaded back into his truck, and neither of us spoke the entire ride back. I think we were both trying to process that kind of raw, unexplainable fear. I spent the rest of that day glued to my phone, half expecting to hear from other neighbors. But the phone never rang. I tried telling myself it was just a freak occurrence, maybe some huge, injured animal I'd never come across before. But in my gut, I couldn't shake the image of that hand-like track and that silhouette standing on two legs. That evening, as I lay in bed replaying it all, I kept questioning everything. Did I really see that shape in the mirror? Was the roar as loud and unnatural as I remembered? Was it just adrenaline messing with my senses? But I knew deep down that something very real and very dangerous had been out there. Nothing else happened that night. No weird noises, no more evidence. The next morning, my friend and I quietly agreed to keep this to ourselves, partly out of embarrassment and partly out of fear that people would think we'd lost our minds. But that single day changed the way I look at the woods around Huntington. Before, I saw them as peaceful land where I could enjoy the quiet and manage wildlife as I saw fit. Now I realize there might be things out there that defy explanation. To this day, I don't have a clue what it was. Maybe it moved on, or maybe it's still out there, keeping its distance. All I know is that I'll never forget the sheer strength needed to rip those stakes from the ground, or that eerie silhouette standing in the field like it owned the place. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that roar in my head, and every muscle in my body tenses up all over again. I wish I had some grand conclusion or a neat answer. But the truth is, whatever I saw that day never showed itself to me again, and I haven't found any more tracks or fresh scratch marks to confirm its existence. Part of me is relieved. Part of me is still uneasy. I'll never be able to explain that day fully. But it happened, and I've got the chills to prove it. If there's one thing I learned, it's that no matter how familiar you think you are with a place, nature can still throw something at you that leaves you questioning everything. And that's exactly what this thing did. Then it vanished just as quickly as it appeared. I haven't stopped looking over my shoulder since. Story 7. I remember that day like it was yesterday. It was late summer of 2015, and I was out in the Alaskan backcountry with a friend, trying to keep track of caribou movements for our upcoming hunts. We were a few hours outside of Sterling, which isn't much more than a small community, but it's the closest place with supplies. After a whole day of hiking through thick pine forests and open stretches of tundra, we decided to rest on a small rise in the terrain. The sun was already low in the sky, casting this washed-out orange light across everything, and the temperature was starting to drop. We were both exhausted from covering so many miles, but I still felt that familiar excitement you get out there, this wild mix of alertness and calm. My friend and I set down our packs and started scanning the area, hoping maybe we'd catch sight of a distant caribou herd. We were just about to call it a day and head back to our makeshift camp when something odd caught our eye. There was a clearing down below, partially framed by tall pine trees, and in the middle of that clearing was a dark figure moving at a slow but purposeful pace. At first, I thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs, but the shape was too tall and narrow. It moved with a smooth, almost unnerving stride, like a person, but something about it felt off. My friend whispered something like, "Do you see that?" and I just nodded, too stunned to speak right away. The figure walked on two legs, and it looked big. Bigger than any person I've ever seen in these woods, and definitely not dressed in any hunting gear or thick jacket. The light was fading, but I could make out some kind of greyish hair or fur catching the last rays of sunlight. We tried using our binoculars to get a clearer view, but between the dim light and the distance, we couldn't make out details. What really unnerved me was how smoothly it crossed the clearing, like it was gliding or something. Then, just like it sensed us watching, it stopped. It turned its head in our direction, or at least that's what it looked like. My stomach lurched. It's one thing to see a weird shape off in the distance. It's another to have that thing look right back at you. Before we could get a better view, it bolted. It moved between the pines in these long strides and just vanished. The whole moment probably lasted 10 or 15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Neither of us said a word at first. We were both trying to convince ourselves we hadn't just seen something impossible. My mind raced with ideas. Maybe it was a local wearing some kind of animal pelt or a trick of the light. But that didn't make sense. There's no reason for someone to be out there in what looked like thick fur, with no pack or rifle or anything to show they were a hunter. Curiosity got the best of us, but so did caution. We grabbed our gear and carefully made our way down the slope toward the clearing. I remember my heart pounding in my ears, and every tree branch snapping underfoot made me twitch. The forest was dead quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds or little animals scurrying around, but the silence felt overwhelming. When we reached the clearing, I noticed something that made my throat go dry. Footprints, pressed deep into the moist ground. Each footprint was big. I've hunted all around Alaska for years, and I'm used to seeing bear tracks and the occasional boot print from other hunters. But these prints were larger than a human's by a long shot. We bent down, checking the size against our own boots, and whatever made them had a stride too lengthy to be a regular person. The shape was somewhat like a bare human foot, but definitely not the right proportions. And all around us, there was this eerie sense that we were standing somewhere we shouldn't be. Then my friend spotted something else. Grey hair snagged on a low branch. Except the branch was over my head level, maybe 7 feet up. I carefully plucked a bit of it. It was coarse like an animal's, but also strangely thin at the same time. It didn't look like moose or caribou hair. My hands were shaking a little, because suddenly it all felt too real. Something tall and hairy had definitely passed through here, and not long ago. We stuck around for a few more minutes, hoping we might catch another glimpse, but it was getting dark fast, and we needed to get back to camp before nightfall. The walk back was tense. My friend and I kept turning around every few steps, feeling like we were being watched, though we never heard or saw anything else unusual. Still, the silence was heavy, like even the wildlife had decided to steer clear. Once we got back to camp, we built a fire and tried to process what had happened. We weren't exactly shaking in our boots, but there was an uneasy feeling neither of us could shake off. We kept replaying the sighting in our heads, each trying to see if the other might have misread the situation. But we both saw the same thing. There was no reason to doubt each other. We ended up deciding not to track it any further, at least not that night. It didn't feel safe to chase something unknown in near darkness, especially that deep in the wilderness. The following morning, we met up with our pilot, who was scheduled to pick us up by float plane. We casually mentioned the weird footprints and the tall figure in the clearing. He just chuckled and said we must have run into the hairy man that local stories talk about. Neither of us knew what he meant exactly, so we pressed him a bit, but he just shrugged it off like it was an ordinary piece of folklore. He told us everyone in the region had some story or another about strange creatures in the woods, and most folks either believed in them or just laughed it off as myth. Over the next few weeks, the memory of that day stuck with me. Even after I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about the way that figure moved, the footprints, and that clump of hair on the branch. My friend and I did our own research, found out that plenty of hunters and locals around Alaska have reported seeing something similar. Some call it the hairy man. Some even go as far as to say it's a Bigfoot-like creature. Honestly, I don't know what to call it. I just know that what I saw wasn't any animal I've ever run into, and it definitely wasn't a person dressed for a wilderness trek. To this day, I can't fully explain it. It's one of those moments where you feel both excitement and dread at once. Excitement because maybe there's something out there we've never officially documented, and dread because if that thing wanted to, it could probably follow you home through miles of silent forest without you ever knowing. Since that trip, I always keep my eyes wide open whenever I return to those remote areas. I haven't seen anything like it again, but sometimes, when I'm out alone and the woods go silent all of a sudden, I get this chill that takes me back to that clearing. That memory won't leave me, and in a weird way, I almost don't want it to. It's a constant reminder that there's more to the wild than we'll ever fully understand. I didn't find any conclusive evidence, and I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything, but I know what I saw, and it shook me. Even now, when I walk into a clearing like that, I can't help but scan the edge of the trees, half expecting to catch a glimpse of that massive silhouette again. Part of me hopes I never do. Part of me wonders if maybe, just maybe, it's still out there, slipping through the pine trees without a sound. And then, as fast as it appeared in my life, it was over. 1 minute we were staring at a shape that shouldn't exist, and the next minute it was gone, leaving nothing but footprints and questions behind. There was no grand confrontation, no big explanation, just a moment of utter confusion and fear, followed by the reality that we would never fully understand what happened. I still get chills thinking about it, and I doubt I'll ever forget those footprints or that tall, hairy figure in the fading Alaskan daylight. That's where I have to leave it. Just a strange encounter in a place known for its untamed wilderness, and me, left with a permanent reminder that sometimes the most unsettling mysteries never really go away. Story 8. I remember it like it happened yesterday, even though it was back in 2012. I had moved into my uncle's remote property near the Bald Hills in Washington, excited for some time in nature and ready to watch the place while he was away. It was a little wooden house surrounded by tall trees, with a river not too far away where I planned to fish. On the surface it seemed perfect, quiet, cozy and peaceful. But there was one day in particular that changed everything I believed about that place. That morning started off normal. I woke up before sunrise because I heard this bizarre scratching sound against the side of the house. It was subtle at first, like branches brushing up against the wooden boards. But then it got louder, almost frantic, like claws scraping across the walls. I was still groggy, so I figured it might be the wind. After all, we were in a forested area. Wind can do weird stuff with old houses. But something about the sound made the hairs on my arms stand up. It felt too intentional, too measured. I put on a jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside to check. The early dawn light was faint, so it was basically me, my flashlight, and the creeping feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked around the exterior, shining the light along the walls, expecting to see maybe an animal scurrying away. But there was nothing. No raccoon, no deer, no bear, no sign of anything. The only odd thing was a faint set of marks close to the base of the wall, almost like claw marks, but spaced out in a way I'd never seen before. I tried not to let it freak me out too much. I told myself it could be some local wildlife with unusual paws. After I got back inside, I made coffee, hoping the day would pass quietly. But I kept hearing strange thuds on the porch. Heavy footsteps, not just the creak of old wood. Every time I went to open the door, though, all I saw was empty space and the same silent trees. It made me feel like I was going crazy, hearing things that no one else could confirm. I even checked with the distant neighbor a few days before, and he joked about the mysteries of the Bald Hills and how people sometimes saw odd figures or heard unexplainable noises. I wrote it off as local legends, but that morning I couldn't help thinking there was something to it. Around midday, I decided to walk the perimeter of the property. By then, the sun was high, and I felt a bit safer. But as I circled the back of the house, I noticed these massive footprints in the softer dirt. They weren't the size of bear tracks, and they definitely had a shape more like a human foot, but bigger and wrong. The spacing of the toes was off, and the stride between each print was huge, far larger than what a normal person could manage. I felt a pit form in my stomach. There's this sense of dread you get when you see something that doesn't fit your understanding of the world. All my rational explanations for the noises started collapsing in my head. I tried to brush it off again, telling myself it was maybe just some weird indentation or a half-erased bear track. But deep down, I knew something about it wasn't right. I snapped a couple of photos with my phone, thinking I'd show them to my uncle, or maybe ask online if anyone recognized the shape. Looking at the pictures on the screen only made me feel more uneasy, because it was obviously not a typical animal print. As afternoon turned into evening, the atmosphere around the house got heavier. It was that feeling like you're being watched, but you can't pinpoint where the eyes might be. Every time I glanced out a window, I thought I saw movement in the trees, just a flicker of motion, or maybe a shadow shifting in a place where the light should be steady. It got to the point where I locked all the doors and windows well before dark, which I normally never did. This was supposed to be a peaceful, isolated place, but there I was, freaking out like I was in the middle of a horror movie. Then, just after sunset, I heard a loud snapping noise, like a big branch breaking under immense pressure, right outside the front door. It was so sudden and powerful that I nearly dropped the plate I was holding. My heart pounded like crazy, but I forced myself to peek through the window. Initially, I couldn't see anything except the dim outline of the porch. But then I caught a glimpse of a tall shape, standing just beyond the reach of my porch light. It was so still that, for a moment, I thought it was a tree trunk. But then it moved. It tilted its head in my direction, like it knew I was watching. I don't think I've ever felt such a raw surge of terror. I wanted to hide, to run, to do anything. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight again, opened the door just a crack, and shone the beam into the dark. The shape disappeared behind a tree so fast that I questioned if I'd even seen it. But I knew I had. The air felt electric, like a warning. I slammed the door shut and locked it. For a while I stood there, back pressed against the wood, listening for any sound. I could hear heavy breathing, or maybe it was my own. Then a scratching sound started up again, near the side window. I couldn't see a silhouette, but I heard it moving from one window to another, circling the house. My hands started shaking and my mind raced with all these questions. Was it an animal, a person, or something else entirely? Eventually the scratching stopped. I waited for what felt like hours in total silence, just listening for the tiniest movement. I was too scared to call anyone because I didn't even know how to describe what was happening, and part of me still doubted my own sanity. Maybe I was experiencing some sort of prolonged paranoia. But then came the final blow. A loud thump, so strong it rattled the windows, right at the back door. It sounded like someone, or something, had slammed its entire weight against it. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed my keys, slipped on my boots, and decided that I had to get out of there, at least for the night. But when I reached the back door, I saw it was partially dented from the outside, like something had tried to break in. My heart almost stopped. If I took one more second, maybe that door would give way. I bolted for the front door instead, yanked it open and ran to my car. The surrounding trees felt menacing, but I kept going. Once I got inside and locked the doors, I turned on the headlights. In that brief flash, I saw a tall figure dart behind a cluster of trees off to my left. It moved in this strange, loping way, like it was crouched low to the ground, but still impossibly tall. I didn't wait to get a better look. I reversed down the gravel driveway and sped away until I hit the main road. I ended up driving around for a couple of hours, too shaken to go back. I considered checking into a motel, but I had nowhere else to really stay long-term, and part of me felt too embarrassed to explain what happened. So, eventually, I returned to the house, but only when it was almost dawn. The place was eerily quiet, and the back door was intact except for that dent. Nothing else seemed out of place, but the whole house felt wrong, like whatever had come around that day had left a trace in the atmosphere. A few days later, I told my uncle about it. He didn't seem shocked, just said he'd heard rumors over the years, something about strange sightings in the Bald Hills. He never experienced it firsthand, though, so he had no advice to give me except stay safe and don't obsess. By the time I left that property for good, I had no real answers. The weird footprints vanished after a rain, and I never caught anything conclusive on camera, just blurry movements at the edges of the frame. To this day, I still get chills thinking about those noises and whatever that tall figure was. I can't prove any of it, but I know what I felt and saw. It's like one moment everything was normal, and then this wave of terror rushed in. And just as quickly as it started, it stopped, leaving me with no real explanation. Every time I recall it, I feel that same twisting fear in my stomach. I've tried to push it out of my mind, but I can't help wondering if something is still roaming those woods, watching, waiting, just beyond the porch light. Story 9. I remember this trip like it was yesterday, even though it happened back in 1995. I'd planned a simple weekend getaway in Rocky Mountain National Park, just north of Glen Haven. My goal was to test out some new camping gear and enjoy a bit of solitude. Nothing fancy, just me, my tent, and the forest. I arrived around 4 in the afternoon on a cloudy day. The forecast mentioned light rain, so I hurried to pitch my tent and start a small campfire. Nothing felt off at first. The area was more remote than the usual campsites, but that was the whole point. There's something almost meditative about setting up your own little spot in the wilderness. The first night passed quietly. I heard the usual rustling and distant animal calls, but figured they were just curious critters passing by. I slept pretty well despite the overcast sky and slight drizzle. The next morning, I woke up early to gather some firewood and explore a bit. The place was gorgeous, towering pines, a cool breeze, and these random pockets of silence where it almost felt like the trees were listening. When I got back to my camp, I noticed the small stack of firewood I'd collected was scattered around. Some pieces were several feet away, like they had been tossed. My first thought was raccoons or squirrels. Maybe they were searching for food among the logs. It was odd, but not alarming enough to stop me from sticking around. I just restacked the wood and went about my day, snapping a few photos of the scenery and checking my gear for the next night. That second night, though, the rain got heavier. I ended up huddling in my tent earlier than I'd planned. I remember drifting off to the rhythmic patter of rain against the fabric, half asleep, half listening to every rustle outside. Around 2 in the morning, I jolted awake to this weird sound, like something was dragging its feet just beyond my tent. Then I felt a faint brushing along the nylon, right near where my head rested. It was gentle at first, then more of a push, as if whatever it was wanted to see what was inside. I'm not proud of how I reacted. I basically yelled at the top of my lungs. It was out of sheer panic. I'm not some seasoned mountain man. The moment I shouted, I heard quick, heavy footsteps moving away, accompanied by a kind of snapping of twigs. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, sitting upright, flashlight clenched in my hand until daybreak. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself outside to check the area. What I found made my stomach drop. There were elongated footprints circling my campsite, almost like someone, or something, had paced around my tent. They looked faintly human in shape, but the proportions were all wrong, almost too long, and the toes were spaced in a strange way. I followed them for a bit, but they just vanished once the terrain got rockier. No sign of more prints, no drag marks, nothing. I packed up my stuff and decided to move further along the trail. I actually crossed paths with a park ranger on my way. I explained what I had seen, some weird footprints and the thing brushing up against my tent. He looked at me like I was describing a UFO. He mentioned a deformed elk or deer might have made those tracks, which seemed like a stretch. But I was already anxious, so I just nodded. I wasn't looking for a debate. I just wanted to find a safer spot with a little more visibility. I trekked another couple of hours until I reached a place that felt more open, with fewer trees pressing in. By the time I set up camp again, the clouds were still heavy, but the rain had slowed down. The early part of that night was so silent, it actually put me on edge. No wind, no distant animal calls, nothing. Around midnight, I was trying to doze off when I heard a light scraping noise, almost like claws or nails against tree bark. Then I heard what sounded like small branches snapping underfoot, close enough to make me hold my breath. I unzipped my tent, just enough to peek out with my flashlight, and that's when I saw a dark shape dart behind the trees. It was tall and moved on two legs. I froze for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just a person, but the way it slunk behind the trunk didn't feel natural. My stomach was in knots. I wanted to call out, but I couldn't get the words out. I just felt my legs tremble as I realized I wasn't alone out there. For maybe 10 seconds, I didn't see anything else, and those were the longest 10 seconds of my life. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to leave. I stayed perfectly still, then decided I'd had enough. In one frantic rush, I shoved my gear into my backpack, didn't even fold the tent properly, tossed everything into the car and took off, even though it was the middle of the night. I remember my hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire drive home. When I finally told some friends about it, their theories ranged from escaped lunatics to misidentified wildlife to elaborate pranks. But none of that felt right to me, especially those footprints. I've tried telling myself it could have been some rare animal, maybe injured or deformed, but I can't shake the feeling that it was something else entirely. The shape it had, and the way it moved, just didn't match any wild creature I've seen, or any human for that matter. Since then, I've been more cautious when choosing my camping spots, especially when I'm on my own. Even today, I still replay that moment in my head, seeing that figure, hearing those footsteps, feeling that weird brush against my tent. It's like an itch in the back of my mind that won't go away. I don't have a neat explanation, and the whole thing ended as abruptly as it started. One moment it was there, and the next, it was just gone. To this day, I'm still not sure what I ran into in those woods, but it left me with a lasting sense that there are things out there we just can't explain. Story 10. I remember that night in 2009 so vividly that even now I get chills thinking about it. I was working as a local officer in a small Montana town near Layton, where folks had been complaining about strange noises on a secluded forest road. Since there weren't many of us on duty at the time, I got assigned to check it out, and I brought another officer with me for backup. Neither of us expected the night to turn into one of the creepiest experiences of our lives. When we arrived, the first thing I noticed was how dark that stretch of road was. Tall pines lined both sides, and the old streetlights were so far apart that they barely lit anything. The moon was out, which helped a bit, but we still had to rely on our flashlights to see where we were going. We parked on a small patch of gravel off to the side. We wanted to walk the edges of the road to see if we could hear anything. At first, it was completely still except for the wind in the pines. I could hear bugs buzzing near the headlights of our car, but no heavy footsteps or weird moaning. We kept moving slowly, shining our flashlights along the tree line. About 20 minutes in, though, I started noticing something. It was faint, like a large body moving over dried pine needles, making a soft rustling sound. It was off to my left at first, so I told my partner, and we both paused. The sound stopped. It was so sudden, like whatever was there knew exactly when we'd stop to listen. We called out, thinking maybe it was a person messing around or a hiker who got turned around. "Whoever's there, come out!" I remember yelling, my voice echoing through the trees. No answer. My partner did the same, shining his flashlight in wide arcs. But we got nothing. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a loud snap, a branch breaking with serious force. My heart jumped. The sound was to our right this time, so we swung our beams over and caught just a glimpse of movement. I swear it looked like a large shape ducking behind a fallen log, but it was quick, just a split-second shadow. We immediately rushed toward it, pushing aside low-hanging branches and stepping over roots. But by the time we got there, it was gone. All we found were these odd imprints in the pine needles. They were hard to make out, almost like footprints, but not quite. If you've ever seen a bear or wolf print, it's pretty distinct. These had a strange shape to them, like they were elongated or partially scuffed. It was impossible to tell how many toes there were or anything like that. The ground wasn't soft, so we couldn't make a decent cast, even if we had the kit. Still, the fact they were there at all confirmed something big was walking around. The worst part, though, was the sense we weren't alone, like eyes were on us the entire time. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the dark trees with my flashlight, but never saw anything. I just had that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the kind that tells you somebody's watching. Sometimes we'd hear these quiet snaps or rustles in different directions, almost as if it was circling us, but it never came close enough to get a good look. My partner and I exchanged looks, and I could see he was as tense as I felt. He was pretty experienced with tracking and wildlife. If it were just an animal, especially a large one, it would have likely made more noise crashing through the underbrush. Instead, this thing moved like it knew the woods inside out, avoiding branches and deadfall like it had done it 1,000 times before. It creeped me out more than I want to admit. After a while, we decided to turn back. Something about that place felt wrong, in a way I still can't fully put into words. We're both trained to handle stressful situations, but this was different. There was a quiet pressure in the air, a suffocating kind of tension. Neither of us liked the idea of walking away without answers, but we felt the best move was to regroup and maybe return with more officers in daylight. On the walk back, the weird sounds continued. Small cracks behind us, a sudden shuffle in the bushes. At one point, I thought I heard something breathing, like a heavy exhale, but when I turned, I saw only darkness. My adrenaline was through the roof. I had my hand on my sidearm, but I didn't want to draw it unless we actually saw a threat. It was unnerving not knowing what was out there. We both tried to stay calm, but it's hard when every snap of a twig makes your heart pound like a jackhammer. When we finally reached our car and flicked on the powerful spotlight, we scanned the trees one last time. Nothing. It was dead quiet again. That's when I realized how drained I felt, like my nerves had been pulled tight for the last hour. We stood there for a moment, breathing hard, scanning every inch of that tree line, but there was no movement. We got in the car, locked the doors, and headed back. The whole drive, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking on the road behind us, but the road stayed empty. In the days after, we filed our report and a few other officers went out there during daylight hours. They didn't find anything conclusive. No fresh prints, no fur, no signs of a camp or anything that would explain it. More locals started sharing their own stories. Late-night sightings of a tall figure among the pines, strange noises that sounded like groaning or whispering. Some thought it was a moose or a deer that got spooked, but that didn't match the way it seemed to move or hide. Others joked it might be some cryptid or creature of legend, but nobody had actual evidence. The weirdest thing is how these occurrences slowly faded out after a few weeks. Reports trickled away, and eventually it was like nothing happened at all. To this day, I can't explain what we encountered. Maybe there's a perfectly reasonable explanation, or maybe there's something out there in those woods that we just haven't identified yet. All I know is that night felt different than any routine patrol I've ever done. There was a presence, something smart enough to stay out of sight, yet bold enough to follow us. Even now, when I think about it, I get that same uneasy feeling, like something unknown was just out of reach, watching from behind the trees. I've been on plenty of calls since then, some more dangerous, some more intense, but nothing has ever left me with that same sense of hair-raising uncertainty. It's like the place itself was alive, and whatever roamed out there was playing a game of cat and mouse with us. I still catch myself wondering if we would have caught a clearer glimpse if we'd pushed on, or if that would have been a terrible mistake. All I'm left with is a handful of half-formed footprints, a few eyewitness accounts, and my own gut feeling that we stumbled into something we couldn't explain. Even the local rumors never settled on a single idea. Some folks still swear it's a misidentified animal. Others claim it's a creature nobody can name. I can't say they're wrong. I only know that for one night, something in those pines was definitely there. And just as suddenly as those encounters started, they stopped, leaving all of us with questions and no real answers. It's the kind of thing that sticks with you, making you wonder what's actually out there in the dark when you think you're alone. Story 11. I remember that day so vividly, mostly because it felt like every weird thing that ever happened around my place decided to show up in one single afternoon. It started off normal, which somehow made the rest of it feel even stranger. I was home with two friends, Sam and Chris, who had stopped by for a little get-together. We were in the living room, doing what we always do, snacking, laughing, and playing video games on my old console. My house is in the mountains near Damascus, New Hampshire, a secluded spot my grandparents purchased in the 1950s. It's literally next to hundreds of acres of thick forest, and sometimes it feels like the woods have a mind of their own. We grew up hearing stories about random lights in the woods, old stone foundations hidden in the hills, and even unmarked graves. But until that particular day, most of the odd stuff I'd experienced had been sporadic. A faucet that turned on by itself in the middle of the night. A light fixture that refused to stay lit in one specific socket. That kind of thing. Strange, sure, but never enough to make me want to run out of the house screaming. Anyway, it was mid-afternoon. We were halfway through this racing game, and I remember the background music suddenly cut out during a loading screen. At first, I figured maybe the game had frozen. Sam pressed a couple of buttons, and Chris made some comment about my ancient console finally giving up the ghost. But then everything went silent in the room, like an uncomfortable hush. It was so noticeable that all three of us looked at each other, kind of waiting for someone to crack a joke or something. That's when we heard a faint metallic clink. I looked over at the coffee table and saw my stainless steel water bottle literally bounce up into the air. It didn't tip over. It didn't roll off the table. It jumped upward maybe 2 feet, spun slightly, then landed right back on the exact same ring of condensation it had left behind. It was so bizarre, I can't even put into words how wrong it looked. The three of us jumped up and let out these startled yells, and then everything was normal again. except for the fact that we were all borderline freaking out. We tried to figure out what could have caused that. The table wasn't vibrating. No one had touched it. There was no sudden movement or earthquake or anything that might explain a bottle basically leaping into the air. Sam swore he felt a rush of cold air pass by his arm at that exact moment, but Chris and I didn't feel it. We all got pretty spooked, so we paused the game and went into the kitchen for some water. Ironic, I know. I'm not sure what we were expecting in the kitchen, maybe a bit of calm. But as soon as we stepped in, I heard a noise like water rushing at full force. The kitchen faucet, which had been firmly off, was gushing water into the sink. It startled me because I was positive we hadn't used the kitchen sink all day. I was the last one in there, and I distinctly remember turning off the tap because my water pressure can be finicky. There it was, on full blast. Sam cursed under his breath, and Chris reached to turn it off. It took me a second to realize that once again, nobody had touched anything. I tried not to freak out, but my heart was beating like crazy. At that point, I started to feel this uneasy tension in the air, like the house itself was charged with static. I've felt something kind of like that before, but never so strong. The hairs on my arms were standing up. Still, we tried to keep our cool. I suggested we go up to the bathroom so I could show them the weird lamp socket that never works. I've replaced the entire fixture twice, changed the wiring, even paid an electrician to check it out, and nothing ever fixes that one socket. The other two bulbs in the same fixture are fine, but that one is always dead. Figured I'd show it off like some local attraction, my personal haunted light. So we get to the bathroom, and sure enough, the middle bulb is out. I turned the switch off, explained the situation, turned it back on, and that middle bulb flickered to life. None of us knew what to say. That middle bulb had never worked before. Never. I was almost relieved to see it light up because at least it proved something was happening beyond normal explanation, right? But then the weird feeling settled in again, and my stomach did a little flip, like I was on a roller coaster. There was this intangible sense that something was messing with us, purposely drawing our attention. After a few seconds, the light suddenly popped off again, and this time it sparked so bright it left a little spot in my vision. My heart was pounding so fast I had to lean against the wall. I think Sam and Chris realized I was genuinely scared, so they suggested we get some fresh air. We walked out the back door, and the second we stepped outside, I felt this wave of relief. It was cold out, but the air felt clearer. We decided to follow one of the old trails leading up the slope behind the house. I'd hiked it 1,000,000 times, but that day I kept glancing over my shoulder like I was expecting to see someone right behind us. The forest was quiet, more silent than usual. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of wind. That hush made everything feel heightened, like all my senses were cranked to max volume. We passed some of those odd stone foundations I'd seen years before, just these random square shapes on the ground made of ancient rock. Their purpose has always been a mystery to me. Local rumor says they date back to early settlers or even older times, but nobody has a firm answer. I felt this strong urge to keep moving, like we were being watched, so we didn't hang around too long. The deeper we went, the more I felt this presence, almost like the forest was breathing around us. Eventually we came across an old, collapsed, tombstone-like marker. No name, no visible date, just a flat stone half buried in the dirt. I've known it was there, but for some reason it felt different that day, like it was radiating an unsettling vibe. I know that sounds dramatic, but that's the best way I can describe it. I got this sudden chill, and Sam must have felt it too because he whispered he wanted to turn back. We all agreed it was probably a good idea. As we returned to the house, I noticed the sky had turned this dull grey, like storm clouds rolling in, even though the forecast had been clear. I was dreading going back inside, half expecting another object to start flying around or more faucets turning on. But when we stepped through the door, the living room was quiet. The console was still on, stuck on the paused screen. The water bottle was just sitting there where it had landed, and everything looked normal again. Even that heavy atmosphere seemed to have vanished. We stayed silent for a minute, each of us waiting for the next bizarre thing to happen. But nothing did. It was almost worse that way, you know. At least when something's happening, you can react. But there was just nothing. Sam said he was done for the day. Chris nodded in agreement, and I couldn't blame them. I felt like I was in someone else's house, or like my own house was wearing a mask. We didn't talk much after that. We just gathered up their stuff so they could drive home before it got dark. Once they left, I sat on the couch, just staring at that steel water bottle. I found myself half expecting it to jump again. It never did. The console's game music resumed playing in a glitchy loop, but then settled into its usual track, and everything stayed totally normal for the rest of the night. I think I just dozed off after a couple of hours, too exhausted to even analyze what had happened. Since that day, I haven't experienced anything quite as intense. Sure, I still get the random flickers from electronics, or I'll hear a weird thud from another room. But not on that level, not like a full-on parade of unexplainable events. I wish I could say I found some hidden journal in my grandparents' attic that explained it all, some record of curses or old legends that told me exactly why these things happen. But I've got nothing, just the memories and the lingering question. What actually happened that day? Even now, I don't have a neat explanation or a fancy theory. It's not like I can call an exorcist or something. The house feels normal most of the time. I sometimes wonder if we just caught the place on a weird day, maybe when some energy in the land was extra active, or maybe the spirits of that old grave or those abandoned foundations decided we needed a reminder that we aren't the only ones who live here. I haven't told many people about it, mostly because it sounds too crazy to believe. But whenever I'm alone and the house creaks in the night, I think back to that day. I remember how real that fear felt, how genuine the confusion was, and how everything stopped as abruptly as it started. And honestly, that lingering mystery is what gets me most, because to this day I still have no idea what lurks in these mountains or why it chose to manifest like that. It's just something I've learned to live with, even though it keeps me on edge every time I hear the slightest noise that I can't explain. Story 12. I still remember that freezing night in January of 1965, even though so many years have passed. We were on our way back to Manhattan after a gig in some tiny upstate town. The roads were practically deserted, just a stretch of endless white under the van's headlights. I was sitting in the back with the rest of the band members. There were 5 of us total, including that famous guitarist. I won't drop his name here, but let's just say he was pretty well known at the time, and we felt lucky to be backing him up. Everything seemed normal until the snowfall got heavier, way heavier than anything I'd ever seen. The flakes were enormous, and within minutes, the roads turned from slippery to downright treacherous. We tried to keep going, hoping we'd outrun the worst of the storm, but our van started swerving. Suddenly, it lurched off the pavement and got stuck in a massive drift on the shoulder of this lonely highway. We were literally out in the middle of nowhere. No buildings, no lights, no passing cars, just emptiness and swirling snow. We got out to see if we could dig ourselves free, but that was impossible. The wind stung my face, and I couldn't even keep my eyes open for more than a few seconds at a time. The guitarist kept swearing under his breath, like the cold was gnawing at his very bones. We tried pushing the van, rocking it back and forth, but the tires just spun, kicking up snow that smacked into us. I honestly thought we might be there all night, with no way to call for help. Cell phones didn't exist, and the nearest town was probably miles away. Then, out of nowhere, The sky turned this weird shade of red, like someone had lit up a giant flare above us. I remember cursing, thinking maybe there was some explosion or emergency flare from another stranded driver. But it wasn't just a single burst of light. It was more like a giant glowing dome that flickered in the clouds. We all squinted, trying to figure out what the hell was going on, and that's when we saw it. This capsule-shaped thing was descending, almost lazily, a few dozen yards down the road. It just hovered there, maybe 30 meters from where we stood, and then came to rest right on top of the snow. It didn't kick up any wind or anything like that. It just landed softly, with these small legs that sank into the drift. I swear, it felt like my chest tightened. My mind was racing. It looked too perfect, too smooth to be some conventional aircraft. If it had made any noise, it was too quiet for us to notice over the gusts of wind. And then a door on the side slid open without a sound. The next few seconds felt unreal. This tall figure emerged. It had an elongated shape, definitely taller than any human I'd seen, and its skin was sort of yellowish. Not like a normal human tone, but something inhumanly pale, with a strange hue. Its eyes, well, I can't even say it had eyes. There were these thin slits where I would expect eyes to be, but no real detail. No lashes, no eyebrows, nothing. I remember my breath catching in my throat. One of my bandmates muttered something like, "What in God's name?" None of us dared to move. I kept thinking, this can't be real, right? Maybe it's the cold messing with our heads. But it felt too vivid. The figure didn't walk. It glided across the snow, almost as if it was floating. As it moved closer, I felt an intense heat radiating from it. The snow at its feet literally melted away, leaving a slushy circle wherever it passed. I could feel beads of sweat forming on my forehead, despite the freezing temperature around us. It got close enough that I could see the strange texture of its skin, like smooth wax, but somehow alive. That's when I started to feel a sort of pressure inside my head. It wasn't painful, more like a force gently pushing against my thoughts. I looked over at the guitarist. He had this shocked expression, his eyes wide and almost teary. It felt like the creature was focusing on him specifically. None of us heard any audible voice, but I swear I felt something like a message, though I couldn't make sense of it. It was like a silent exchange, a conversation that bypassed words. Suddenly, the temperature around us shot up even more, and the snow piled around the van began to melt rapidly. Steam rose in thick clouds, and the white mound that had trapped our tires was now turning into slush and water, sliding off the asphalt. The guitarist just stood there, almost transfixed, while the rest of us started backing away, terrified, but also strangely mesmerized. In less than a minute, the van was free. The creature hovered in place for a moment, like it was checking its work. Then it turned, or pivoted, I'm not even sure how it moved its body, and drifted back toward that capsule. The heat in the air began to recede, and that freezing cold crept back in. The door on the capsule slid open again, and the figure vanished inside. Next thing I knew, the capsule shot upward with a sharp, almost unnatural motion. It left behind a trail of glowing red light that stayed in the clouds for a few seconds before fading out. Just like that, the storm enveloped the road again, the wind howling, and new snow started to fall in thick clumps, quickly covering the melted patch. We all ran back to the van, hearts pounding. The guitarist stumbled, shaking like a leaf. We jumped in, started the engine, and the tires found traction immediately. It was as if we'd never been stuck at all. I remember looking back through the rear window, trying to see if the craft was still up there, but all I caught was the snow quickly piling up over the spot where the thing had landed. The red glow in the sky was gone, replaced by the blackness of that winter night. We drove in near silence for a while, everyone in some sort of collective shock. The only sounds were the engine and the scraping of the windshield wipers against the glass. Eventually, we made it to the outskirts of a small town, found a gas station, and tried to warm up. I think we all understood that telling anyone about this would probably earn us labels like crazy, attention seekers, or weirdos. And sure enough, when we did attempt to talk about it later, people gave us those exact reactions: skeptical stares, condescending smirks, and awkward brush-offs. The guitarist, though, he was the most shaken. In interviews years later, he'd occasionally drop hints about an unexplainable event that gave him a new perspective on life, but he never spelled it out in full detail. Can't blame him. Even among our little group, we weren't sure what exactly we had witnessed. The memory still sends chills down my spine, and it's not just the cold I recall, it's that feeling of something beyond our understanding tapping directly into our minds. I've never experienced anything like that before or since. I don't have a neat conclusion or grand explanation. It happened, then it was over, and that's pretty much it. We finished the trip, somehow performed our next show as scheduled, and life moved on. But I still get goosebumps when I think about that silent communication, that suffocating heat in the middle of a blizzard. To this day, I have no clue what we saw or how to make sense of it. All I know is, no matter how many times people might roll their eyes or call me delusional, I can't deny what I felt out there, the realest, strangest, and most unsettling moment of my life. And it still makes me wonder, what exactly was that being, and what did it really want with us on that lonely highway in the dead of winter? Story 13. I still remember the crunch of gravel under my shoes that afternoon in 1968. I must have been around 10, and my younger brother was maybe 8. We lived in Willow Creek, Massachusetts, a pretty quiet place back then. We usually walked home from school along a route lined with tall trees and neat houses. The day was sunny, but there was a slight chill in the air, typical for early fall. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until we reached that old chestnut tree. Even today, I can picture the big brown leaves scattered across the sidewalk. My brother and I were talking about some silly thing that happened in class when I felt an odd sense of being watched. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I noticed 2 men standing by the trunk of that massive chestnut tree. They were wearing black suits and matching hats, which felt completely out of place for the casual neighborhood vibe. I remember thinking they looked like they belonged in a funeral procession. The weirdest part was how they moved. They stepped out from behind the tree, but there was no sound, no leaves rustling or twigs snapping. It was like they were gliding. The hair on my arms stood up. I tried to pretend I didn't notice them, so I kept walking, but my brother slowed down. He must have felt that unsettling presence too. Suddenly, one of the men stepped forward, blocking our path. He was tall and had a face that barely showed any expression. His eyes looked almost too dark, like there was no detail in them. He asked me in a strangely flat voice, "What did you see that night?" It threw me off guard completely. At first, I had no clue what he meant. Part of me wanted to laugh, but there was something in his tone, like he was certain I knew what he was talking about. The second man came closer, and I remember feeling panic creeping in. He had this stiff posture, and his lips barely moved when he spoke. He asked me to describe the luminous object. I was so confused. I said I didn't know what they were talking about, but my words stumbled out in a shaky mess. My brother just stood there behind me. I could tell he was scared, but he kept quiet. I felt like my heart was trying to beat its way out of my chest. Everything about these men seemed off, from their clothes to their voices. Their questions didn't make any sense, but they asked them in a way that made me wonder if I had accidentally seen something important without realizing it. It dawned on me how bizarre this situation was. 2 adults, dressed like undertakers, grilling a couple of kids on a suburban sidewalk. I felt trapped, like I was in someone else's nightmare. I wanted to grab my brother and bolt, but my feet felt glued to the pavement. Then one of them, the taller one, said something that still sends chills down my spine. He warned me not to tell anyone about what I'd witnessed. I remember him using that word, witnessed, and his voice had a sharp edge to it. He said it'd be dangerous if I insisted on talking. His words made no sense to me, but there was a cold threat in the way he spoke. In a surge of adrenaline, I reached for my brother's hand, turned around, and took off. We sprinted down the sidewalk, leaves scattering under our feet. I was breathing so hard I thought my lungs would explode. My brother was panting behind me, trying to keep up. When I finally risked a glance over my shoulder, those men were just gone, completely vanished. There was no place to hide that quickly, which scared me even more. It was like they simply blinked out of existence. We didn't stop running until we were almost home. My legs felt like jelly, and my brother was breathing so heavily he could barely talk. Our mum was standing by the front door, probably just waiting for us to come home from school, oblivious to the fact that we'd just had the most terrifying encounter of our young lives. I didn't say a word to her about it. I was afraid she'd laugh it off, or, worse, get upset thinking we were making up stories. That evening my brother asked me, "What was that all about?" And I realized I didn't have a logical explanation. I just told him not to worry, that we should forget about it. But of course I couldn't. I spent that night tossing and turning, wondering if they were going to come back or if they knew where we lived. The next day, we took the long way home, avoiding that street altogether. We eventually mustered the courage to go back to the chestnut tree a few days later to see if there were any footprints or tire marks from a car. It was pointless. There was nothing. Everything looked normal, like the men had never been there in the first place. Years went by, and I tried pushing that memory to the back of my mind, but I could never fully shake it off. Then one day, as a teenager, I stumbled across some article talking about men in black encounters. It was like a punch in the gut because everything described in those stories lined up with what we experienced. The black suits, the odd questions about strange lights in the sky, the intimidating vibe. And that's when I remembered. About a week before that incident, I'd been out in my backyard with a small telescope, just stargazing. I must have stayed out longer than usual because I was fascinated by how clear the night sky was. I don't recall seeing anything out of the ordinary, but maybe I missed something. Or maybe I glimpsed something odd without realizing how significant it could be. My brother and I talked about it a few times as we got older, but he mostly chalked it up to childhood imagination mixed with real people being weird. Still, I can't ignore how unsettling they were, how they vanished so quickly, how their voices sounded rehearsed and emotionless, and how they seemed so sure I had seen something big. To this day, I have no explanation for those men or their weird interrogation. It all happened so fast, like a sudden jolt of fear that never completely faded. Even now, when I think about it, I get that prickling sensation on my neck, remembering how their eyes looked and the tone of their voices. It's like they appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as fast, leaving behind a threat I never fully understood. Sometimes I wonder if there was a hidden truth in their questions, if I somehow glimpsed something in the sky that set off a chain of events I'll never comprehend. Other days, I convince myself it was just a strange run-in with two very peculiar people. But a small part of me keeps revisiting that encounter, looking for answers that still aren't there. All I know is, after that day, I never felt completely at ease walking home. And even though Willow Creek remained quiet and uneventful, that single moment made me realize not everything in our everyday lives is as normal or safe as it seems. Then, just like that, the whole experience ended. No explanation, no closure, no second encounter. It was as if those men slipped out of reality once they said their piece. I still catch myself watching the sky sometimes, wondering if maybe I did see something up there, something that made those strange men in black suits appear by that old chestnut tree. Decades later, I have no proof of what really happened, but the memory is burned into my mind. And no matter how many years pass, I can't shake the feeling that for a brief moment, I got too close to a secret I never realized I had. Story 14. I still remember it so vividly. I was about 6 years old at the time, back in 1972, visiting my uncle who lived in a small town called Skyview, Ohio. His house was simple, with creaking wooden floors and this constant smell of old books and dust. Nothing about it seemed out of the ordinary, except for one room that everyone always brushed off as just another guest room. I, on the other hand, had a name for it: the mummy's room. The very first time I stepped into that room, I felt this weird tingling in my stomach, like when you walk into a cold basement unexpectedly. Something just felt off. In my young mind, I somehow convinced myself that a woman wrapped in white bandages was lying on the bed, completely still, just like those classic movie mummies you see in black and white horror flicks. I remember that I would stand in the doorway staring, heart pounding so loudly that I could hear it in my ears. The figure never moved, but it was so clear to me that I couldn't believe everyone else claimed to see nothing. I tried to get my mom or my grandma to come in and see, but the moment they showed up, it was like the room went back to being totally normal. That bed was empty, just an old quilt folded neatly at the foot. They thought I was just playing games or letting my imagination run wild. But I knew, deep in my gut, that something was on that bed whenever I was alone. One day, I got bolder, or maybe just too curious for my own good. I stood there in the doorway, staring at what I believed to be this bandaged woman's outline. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to keep looking. Nothing happened for several seconds. Then, out of nowhere, the figure sat up, like someone waking from a deep sleep. The bandages still clung to its body, and I remember how slowly it turned its head toward me, as if carefully revealing its face. The terror was instant. I couldn't even scream right away because I was too overwhelmed by fear. My knees felt weak, my stomach turned to ice, and it was like the whole world just froze for a second. When my voice finally came back, I let out the loudest scream I could muster and ran straight to my mom. I pulled her by the hand, tears streaming down my face, trying to show her what I saw. But the room was empty again, bed perfectly normal, no sign of anything strange. She looked at me with a mix of confusion and worry, probably thinking I was just having nightmares or something. But I could hardly explain the waves of cold dread I felt in that room. I remember the sensation of absolute panic, like something otherworldly had just locked eyes with me. As I grew older, I questioned my own memories. Maybe I'd dreamt it. Maybe my child's mind had fused some old blanket or clothing into a mummy-like shape. But every time I closed my eyes and pictured that moment, it felt way too real to be just a hallucination. My uncle was a prankster, but even he swore he wasn't doing anything to mess with me. And I could tell by his voice he was serious. Plus, how could he have faked that cold, suffocating presence I felt? Years later, when I was a teenager, I ended up back in that house for a weekend to help with my uncle's dog. I had no choice but to stay in the same room, which by then had new furniture and fresh paint on the walls. Still, the thought of sleeping there made my skin crawl. My cousin and I were in there talking, sharing silly stories, but the second I brought up the mummy incident, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. We both felt goosebumps at the exact same time, almost like an invisible draft had passed right over us. We didn't see any figure that night, but the tension in the air was thick, and we quickly decided we'd rather sleep on the living room floor than spend another minute in that space. The next morning, it was as if nothing had happened. The house felt normal again, no chills, no heavy atmosphere. My mom and grandma stuck to their story that I must have been an overly imaginative kid. They'd say that old houses have strange drafts and funny noises that can play tricks on you. But to me, it went way beyond a simple draft or a creaky floorboard. I know I saw something. I still get shivers whenever I replay that moment in my head. The slow way that bandaged figure sat up, the eerie tilt of its head, and that overwhelming feeling I was in the presence of something I couldn't understand. To this day, I have no proof, no photos, no evidence, just the memory that refuses to fade. I've wondered if it was some kind of manifestation, like a leftover energy from a previous tenant, or maybe something else entirely. Or, maybe it was all in my young mind. But even so, the vividness still haunts me. I've felt my heart race just writing this all down, as if the memory itself holds some kind of power over me. I don't have a neat explanation or a grand finale. After that night when I was a teenager, it never happened again, and I never saw that figure in the house. It's like it vanished without a trace, leaving me only with the heavy realization that sometimes you just can't explain certain things. And honestly, that's what terrifies me the most, that it came and went like a bad dream, but felt more real than anything else in my life. Even now, I can't fully wrap my head around it. It's just there, lodged in my memory, a chilling reminder that some things are beyond our understanding. Story 15. I still get chills when I think about that night in the summer of 2014. It was supposed to be a fun trip. Me and 3 friends out fishing for catfish in this remote spot near Claysville, Ohio. We always liked heading out around sunset, then finding some quiet edge of the lake where almost no one else showed up. That night, we arrived just after 9, and the fog was so thick I couldn't see much beyond the dim glow of our lanterns. We parked our 2 cars on a patch of dirt near the water, unpacked our gear, and started getting comfortable. It was the kind of place where you barely see any headlights passing by, especially after dark. We set up a small fire, just enough to give us some warmth and light without drawing too much attention. Everything was peaceful for a good while. We were joking around, sipping a few beers, and waiting for that sweet tug on our lines. The lake was dead quiet, just the occasional splash of fish. But then we heard this loud kersplow. It sounded way heavier than a fish jumping. It was like someone was chucking big rocks into the water. It echoed across the reservoir, so we all stopped talking, turned our lanterns toward the sound, and just waited. Nothing followed. We tried to shrug it off as our imagination or maybe something falling from a tree. We went back to talking, a little more on edge, but still trying to keep the mood light. After a while, we realized we were running low on firewood, so we decided to gather some from the nearby woods. The plan was to split up briefly. 2 of us would search one side, and the other 2 would head in the opposite direction. I went off with my buddy, stepping through the brush and tall grass. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the fog just made everything look like a scene from some horror movie I wished I wasn't starring in. After about 5 minutes, we heard crunching footsteps behind us. We spun around, trying to see through the haze, but no one was there. Then we heard another crack in the distance. My buddy whispered he thought he saw movement, a flicker of shadow, but I couldn't see a thing. Suddenly, we heard rustling from the other side, and our other friend came barreling out of the trees, holding this torn, filthy old coat, a rubber boot, and a clown mask. I remember his face looked drained of color. He was panting like he'd just run a marathon. He said he found those items scattered in the dirt near a narrow trail. We all tried to brush it off with nervous laughter, saying maybe some kids were playing pranks. But it felt off, especially that mask. It wasn't like a little kid's party mask. It was this grungy, peeling thing that smelled like damp leaves. We decided we had enough firewood for the night and headed back to our camp, trying to act like it wasn't creeping us out. Once we returned, The fog lifted just a bit, and that's when we saw headlights far in the distance on the same dirt road we'd used. It was another car rolling in. We'd see the beams cut through the darkness, then vanish behind the trees, then reappear when the path opened up again. Part of me hoped it was just other fishermen, but something about that car made us all uneasy, like we knew we weren't alone, and they might not be friendly. Still, we tried not to panic. Minutes later, we heard voices, or rather shouts, from deeper in the woods. The words were garbled, like someone was either drunk or deliberately yelling nonsense to freak us out. My heart started racing because it didn't sound like your usual group of guys clowning around. It sounded aggressive. We all looked at each other, and that was the moment we agreed we should probably leave. Then came another curse blow, louder than before, so close that I swear I felt the ripples hit the shore by my feet. We shined our lanterns toward the water, but the darkness and fog swallowed everything. This time, I was genuinely scared, like we were about to have a real problem with whoever was lurking out there. We didn't want to risk staying any longer, so we started packing up our rods and gear as fast as we could. Our nerves were so shot that we nearly dropped half of it on the ground, and just as we were fumbling to get our stuff together, the shouts picked up again, closer. It was like they were taunting us. Could have been one person yelling or multiple people. It was hard to tell with the echoes bouncing off the trees and water. I felt my palms go clammy. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to keep moving, stuffing everything into the back of the car. Finally, we got the fire out, slammed the car doors, and took off up the dirt road, leaving the other car's headlights behind us. When we got to the main highway, we almost crashed right into an old beat-up car turning onto the same road. It must have been the one we saw parked out there earlier. It was packed with people, their faces barely visible, but I noticed at least one of them looking straight at us, like they were sizing us up. We didn't stop. We just floored it past them, and they stared at us the entire time. My adrenaline was going full blast, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible would have happened if we'd stayed any longer. We didn't speak much on the drive back. Everyone was on edge, scanning the rear-view mirrors, half expecting that old car to come speeding behind us. It never did, and by the time we reached the gas station in town, we were finally able to breathe a little. That's when one friend mentioned how he'd heard rumors about shady stuff going on in those woods. Things like meth labs and groups that did who knows what at night. Suddenly, that weird curse blow noise and those unsettling shouts started to make more sense. They might have been tossing junk in the lake to scare us off, or just messing with us for fun. Or maybe something more sinister was going on. We still don't know. That's the part that bothers me the most, the not knowing. It could have been a bunch of bored jerks pulling a stunt, or it could have been something way more dangerous. The thought of that clown mask, those random clothes, and the way those people yelled from the darkness still gets under my skin. It's like they wanted us to realize we didn't belong there, and that they were calling the shots. Ever since that night, I've never felt completely at ease fishing in remote spots. We now pick more populated areas, even if it means catching fewer fish. It's just not worth the dread that creeps in when the sun goes down, and you suddenly wonder who else is out there watching. That night in 2014 changed how I feel about the woods after dark, especially out by that reservoir in Claysville. The strangest part is how it all just stopped. The next day there was no report of anything weird happening, no mention of a group of creeps in a junkie car. It was like it began and ended with us. Sometimes I think about the people in that car, or whoever was hurling things into the water, and I wonder if they just drifted back into the night, waiting for someone else to wander out there. I don't have any neat conclusion or explanation. All I know is what I saw and heard, and it was enough to keep me away from that place for good. There's a part of me that wishes I'd never gone at all. But I did, and I'll never forget how it felt to stand there in the fog, hearing those awful echoes in the darkness, and realizing that, For one terrifying night, we weren't welcome in those woods, and whoever was there made damn sure we knew it. Story 16. I remember that day in 2018 like it was yesterday. My girlfriend and I, along with 2 other couples, decided to camp in a state park near Morton, Michigan. We'd been looking forward to it for weeks. Just some fresh air, a quiet lake, and no big crowds. We picked a secluded spot, set up our tents, and got a nice fire going for dinner. It was peaceful. The sun had just dipped below the tree line, and the sky was sprinkled with stars. It felt like the perfect getaway. Around 10 p.m., when it was already pretty dark, we started hearing these weird screams echoing through the woods. At first, I thought it might be someone who'd had too much to drink, just messing around. But as I listened more carefully, it sounded off, like a woman's voice, high-pitched and frantic, repeating something we couldn't make out. None of us recognized the words she was shouting, and it definitely didn't sound playful. It was coming from deep in the forest, not from the main trail or the parking lot. My stomach knotted up because nobody usually wanders that far into the woods alone at night. We all got really quiet, straining our ears to pick up any clue. The shouts seemed to stop for a moment, and we exchanged those nervous looks you give when you're not sure if you should do something or ignore it. Part of me wanted to walk toward the sound, but something told me it wasn't a good idea. The woods can be unforgiving at night, and if she was in some sort of trouble, or worse if it was a trap, who knew what we'd be walking into? Before we could even decide, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was this woman stumbling toward our camp, her clothes caked in mud and leaves like she'd been crawling around. The light of our fire lit up her face, and I remember how her eyes looked wild, almost too wide, like she was on high alert or possibly hallucinating. She started rambling in this hurried, slurred way. I couldn't piece together half of what she was saying, but it sounded like she was demanding food and a place to sleep. She kept saying we had to help her right now. My girlfriend tried to be nice, asking if she was hurt and offering her water. The woman grabbed the bottle and threw it onto the ground, complaining she wanted something stronger. There was this overpowering chemical smell coming off her, something that reminded me of cleaning supplies mixed with sweat and dirt. That's when it really hit me that she might be high on something. She just planted herself by our fire, practically forcing her way into our circle, refusing to leave. Her speech was all over the place. 1 minute she was asking for help, the next she was yelling at us like we were enemies. She mentioned voices, like she was hearing multiple people in her head, and at one point she started arguing with them out loud, as if they were giving her orders or mocking her. One of my friends calmly asked her to explain what she needed so we could figure out how to help, but that just set her off. She glared at him, called him a bunch of nasty names, and demanded we let her stay. I remember my heart pounding because I had no idea if she was armed or capable of violence. The way she switched between pleading and threatening so quickly was terrifying. I finally mustered the courage to tell her she couldn't stay. We suggested she head back toward the main entrance, where park staff or rangers might be around to help. As soon as I said that, she stood up, swore at all of us, and stormed off in the same direction she came from. But the disturbing part was that we could still hear her voice out there, circling around as if she wasn't sure where to go. The yelling got quieter and louder in waves, almost like she was wandering in a big loop. It felt impossible to relax or pretend we were safe. My girlfriend was trembling, and the rest of us just sat there, too freaked out to move. Nobody was in the mood to sleep, especially not in our separate tents, so we all stayed around the fire, keeping an eye on the trees, jumping at every snap of a twig. I kept scanning the darkness, half expecting her to appear again. Everyone was clutching some makeshift weapon, a camping hatchet, a flashlight, a big stick, just in case. I couldn't believe the night had taken such a turn from a peaceful campout to this tense standoff with a stranger who seemed completely unhinged. About an hour later, we heard her screaming again, this time sounding much farther away. We all took a deep breath, relieved she wasn't right on top of us, but still anxious. Her voice echoed a couple more times, then faded out. We didn't know if she'd just collapsed somewhere, or if she'd found another campsite to bother. The forest felt even more menacing with that mystery hanging in the air. At the crack of dawn, we decided we weren't sticking around. We quickly packed everything, barely speaking, just focusing on getting our gear together and getting out. My nerves were shot from the lack of sleep and the constant fear that woman might ambush us. As soon as we were done, we headed straight to the park exit. There was a park employee near the entrance, so we told him what happened, describing the woman as best we could, her clothes, her smell, her behavior. He didn't seem shocked, which was unsettling. He mentioned that every so often they got reports of people wandering the woods under the influence of drugs, especially in some of the more remote parts of the park. He told us that the best approach was to avoid confrontation and contact the rangers. I felt relieved nothing worse had happened, but it still left me uneasy. I haven't been able to forget that night. The sight of that woman's eyes in the firelight and the fear in everyone's faces still haunt me. I keep replaying the moment she emerged from the woods, demanding we let her join us. I keep asking myself what would have happened if we had refused more aggressively, or if she'd been armed. After that incident, I always do extra research before choosing a campsite, checking reviews and keeping tabs on any reported incidents of odd behavior in the area. To this day, I have no idea what became of her after she wandered off. It's like she vanished into the darkness, leaving nothing but that haunting memory. All I know is that the woods that night felt way less peaceful and a lot more dangerous than I ever expected. I still get chills thinking about how quickly a quiet camping trip can turn into something terrifying, and I never really got closure, which might be the most unsettling part. It started and ended just as abruptly, and it's stuck with me ever since. Story 17. I remember that day in early October like a stain in my mind. The air was cold enough that every breath I took seemed to linger in front of me. I'd been working search and rescue in Redland County since 2015, so I was used to last-minute calls. But this one felt off from the moment my phone rang. The dispatcher said a forest ranger disappeared in a remote area, and I was to meet Sheriff Donovan at a small hunting cabin near the edge of the wilderness. Simple enough, I thought, but the tone in the dispatcher's voice made my stomach twist. When I arrived at the cabin, the sun was barely up. The place looked worn, like it hadn't been used in years, though it still smelled faintly of old coffee and stale cigarettes. Donovan was already there, along with two of his deputies, Kelly and Bryant. None of us spoke much. They had a large map spread across a rickety table, with a red circle indicating the spot where the missing ranger had last checked in. It was near a remote hiking trail, far from any main roads. Donovan mentioned the ranger had made a strange transmission right before his radio died, but nobody would say exactly what he reported. We set out a little after sunrise. The forest felt unnervingly still, like it was holding its breath. I've hiked those woods 100 times, but something about the silence that day put me on edge. Usually you hear birds or the rustling of squirrels, but I heard only our boots crunching the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed to vanish, leaving the air dense with tension. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see something peeking through the trees. About an hour in, Kelly stopped us and pointed at the ground. There were footprints in the damp earth, big ones. The shape was almost human, but the toes were spread out in a way that made no sense. They were too wide, too off. Bryant crouched down, trying to measure them with his hand. He said they were at least twice the size of a normal footprint. None of us could figure out what could leave tracks like that, certainly not a bear. The pattern was too strange. A chill ran through me when we heard the first low growl. It was so deep that I felt it in my chest more than I heard it in my ears. We switched on our flashlights, even though it was still daytime. Guess it was instinct, a need for any extra security. I scanned the thick trunks and the layered brush for movement, but everything stayed still. The growl came again, echoing around us, but we couldn't pinpoint the source. My heartbeat hammered as I realized how isolated we were. Then we heard something crack, a stick snapping, followed by quick, heavy steps circling us just beyond our line of sight. My throat tightened as I tried to swallow back my fear. Each time we turned, the steps seemed to shift direction, like something was pacing and toying with us. Donovan signaled for us to stay alert, his hand hovering near his holster. None of us wanted to shoot blindly, but we also didn't want to be caught off guard. We pressed on, and eventually arrived at a small clearing. In the center lay a strange pile of branches, leaves, and random scraps. It looked like some sort of nest, or maybe a crude shelter. Among the debris, I spotted a torn piece of cloth that matched the color of a ranger's uniform. Nearby were a half-buried radio and a dented flashlight that looked like the model we use in the field. My stomach dropped. If these belonged to the missing ranger, it meant we were in the right place, just not a safe one. Suddenly, something moved at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a tree shifting in the wind, but it stepped forward, and I realized it was far taller than any human I'd ever seen. It was thin, but with a kind of wiry strength, the skin a pale gray that almost blended with the birch trunks behind it. The eyes had a dull, reddish glow, like embers in a dying fire. I froze, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Donovan shouted for it to stay back, though I doubt it understood a word, and before I could blink, 2 gunshots rang out. Bryant had fired, but the thing barely flinched. It moved with a smooth speed, like it was weightless. Another growl tore from its throat, rattling my nerves. I aimed my rifle, heart pounding, and joined the others in a desperate attempt to scare it off. But it was like shooting at smoke. Each shot felt useless. Then we heard more movement in the brush, circling us just beyond our peripheral vision. My hands were shaking so badly it was hard to keep my flashlight steady. I glimpsed at least 2 more forms slipping between the trees, each one with that same elongated frame, the same eerie eyes. Kelly yelled that we were surrounded, and I realized if we stayed, we'd be cornered. Donovan ordered us to move. We sprinted through the trees, branches slapping our faces and snagging at our jackets. The entire forest seemed alive with unnatural sounds, growls, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. No matter how fast we ran, I felt like we were being herded. My lungs burned, but I couldn't stop. The adrenaline surge was the only thing keeping me from collapsing. I remember cursing under my breath, wondering what in God's name we'd stumbled into. We burst through a thick patch of shrubs and found ourselves staring at a tall fence topped with barbed wire. It shouldn't have been there. We'd studied the map that morning, and there was no mention of any fenced property. Yet here it was, a gate with a heavy padlock and a set of strange insignias on a rusted sign. Before we could argue about our next move, the gate swung open and a man in a dark uniform stepped out. He had this hard, almost robotic look in his eyes and told us we needed to follow him. No time for questions. I don't know what possessed me to trust him, but the desperation to escape those creatures was enough. We followed him into what looked like some hidden facility, half buried in the hillside. The hallways were narrow, lit by flickering fluorescent lights. He led us to a small room with heavy doors and told us to stay put. Donovan tried to demand answers, but the man just repeated that we were in danger and they were handling it. Handling what exactly? He wouldn't say. We waited there, hearing muffled commotion outside, like people running back and forth, shouting orders. My stomach turned as I realized nobody had mentioned the missing ranger, and none of the facility staff seemed concerned about him at all. It felt like we'd stepped into something far bigger than a standard rescue mission. After what felt like an hour, though it might have been less, the man came back and said we were to leave immediately. He warned us not to speak about what we'd seen. We were escorted outside back to the fence. The creatures were nowhere in sight. The forest was deathly quiet again, like it was before. The man handed Donovan a sealed envelope and repeated that we weren't to mention this to anyone. Then he simply locked the gate behind us, and we were left standing there in stunned silence. We retraced our path to the cabin, occasionally checking over our shoulders, half expecting those things to be following. But we never saw them again. It was like everything just stopped. No sign of the nest, no footprints, nothing. We filed our report with the bare minimum of details, just enough to say we searched and couldn't find the ranger. The official story was he wandered off and likely succumbed to the elements. But I've been haunted ever since, wondering if he was taken, or if he's still out there somehow. That day still doesn't make sense to me, and I don't think it ever will. It's like we brushed against a part of the world nobody's supposed to see, or maybe a nightmare that bled over into reality. No matter how often I replay it in my head, I can't explain the creatures, the secret facility, any of it. And even now, when I'm out on a routine search and rescue, I find myself listening for that deep growl in the trees, waiting for the silence to swallow me again. I've never told anyone else the full story. I'm not even sure I'd believe it myself if I hadn't lived it. But it happened, all in one day, and I still get chills just thinking about it. Story 18. I still remember the exact chill in the air that evening back in 2016, up in northern Ontario, near Long Lake. I'd gone there with a co-worker, hoping for a few quiet days of fishing and camping, far away from everything. The spot was known for its big catfish and peaceful atmosphere, and I was excited to just unplug and enjoy nature for a bit. We settled in on our second day, feeling pretty accomplished since we'd already caught a few catfish. We decided to clean them up and hang whatever was left in a tree, mostly to keep animals away. It wasn't my first time doing this, so I felt pretty confident nothing weird would happen. I was wrong. The sun had dipped below the trees, and we were wrapping up around the fire when we heard something approaching. It started as a subtle rustling, like soft footsteps in the brush, but it had this cautious rhythm, almost like it was trying not to be heard. I remember looking at my co-worker, both of us just shrugging at first. Could have been a raccoon or fox sniffing around for scraps. But something about the sound felt off. It was too controlled, too calculated, like it was aware of us and didn't want to be noticed. Then, out of nowhere, we heard these quiet, muffled laughs. They sounded so bizarre, almost like they were trying to mimic a human giggle, but not quite getting it right. I felt my stomach twist. We both went to check the fish we'd hung up, thinking maybe an animal had gotten to them. That's when we saw this small shape, maybe the size of a kid, moving way too fast around the rocks near our tree. My flashlight caught a glimpse of something with long arms and grayish skin, hunched over like it was trying to stay low. It definitely wasn't a raccoon or any fox I've ever seen. The next thing I knew, it darted behind the rocks. All I remember is feeling this surge of adrenaline, and my heart started pounding like crazy. My co-worker tried to get a better look with his own flashlight, but we couldn't see anything except some scattered branches and the vague outline of stone. And then those laughs started up again, circling around our campsite, like multiple echoes. I swear my hands were shaking even though I tried to keep steady. When we got closer to the tree, we noticed something had yanked a couple of the fish off the branch. The line was torn in a way that didn't make sense for just a small animal. It looked like something with freaky strength had tugged them free. We didn't see the creature clearly again for a couple of minutes, but its presence was obvious. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of eyeshine at the edge of my flashlight beam, just outside our camp's perimeter, reflecting this eerie glow like a cat's eyes would. Except it was taller than any cat I've known, and it moved more like a weird, hunched little person. At one point, it lurched back into view, carrying what looked like one of our fish. We barely had time to react before it dropped the fish on the ground and scuttled off. The speed was unreal. It vanished into the darkness, and that was the last time we saw it. Those unsettling giggles stopped after that, like it had decided we were too much trouble and left in a rush. But I was still on edge, unable to relax. We cleaned up as best we could and made sure nothing else was left out. Neither of us wanted to sleep, but eventually we had no choice. We climbed into our tent and laid there with our hearts thumping, listening for any crunch of leaves or twig snaps. Part of me kept expecting those weird little laughs to start up again. Thankfully, the night stayed silent. When the sun came up, I felt a bit more confident, so we took a look around. We found odd impressions in the dirt near the tree, like tiny footprints but not fully shaped, more like partial outlines. There was also a noticeable drag in the soil, almost like something had pulled our leftover bait in a hurry. We tried following it, but lost track among the rocks and roots. The deeper we went into the woods, the more I felt like we were trespassing somewhere we shouldn't be. We ended up heading back to camp quickly, both of us rattled and not wanting to press our luck. Later that morning we decided to pack it in. The area felt different, as if the usual calm had been replaced by this lingering sense that we weren't alone. On the drive back, neither of us spoke for a while. We kept glancing in the rearview mirror like we expected something to be following. I felt foolish, but every nerve in my body was tense until we were miles away. Looking back, I still can't shake off how unnatural it felt. I've spent plenty of time outdoors, and I've encountered all kinds of wildlife, but I've never seen anything that resembled a small, greyish figure with a hunched back and long arms. The way it moved and the way it laughed. I've never heard anything like that before. It didn't behave like a typical forest animal, and it definitely gave off this eerie, almost sentient vibe. Even after all these years, I can't fully explain what we witnessed. Some people talk about weird folklore, little forest folk, or even cryptid sightings in remote places. All I know is I saw something out there that I can't rationalize. It's not the kind of thing I'd ever want to run into again, and since then, I've been reluctant to camp in such isolated spots. The memory still creeps up on me when I'm alone in the woods. It's that feeling of being watched by something you can't quite see, and it's worse knowing that it's definitely watching you back. Even now, I'm not sure if it was an animal, something supernatural, or some unknown creature that just lives in those woods. I just know it happened, and I still get chills whenever I think about it. I never found any solid evidence, no pictures or footprints to prove it, but what I saw and heard that night was all too real for me, and to this day, I have no explanation for it. Story 19. Back in 2020, I went on one of my usual hunting trips near Harper Forest in Maryland. I'd been going there for years and considered myself pretty experienced in the outdoors. It was a chilly morning, the kind that makes your breath hang in the air but isn't painfully cold. I was out checking small game traps, hoping to snag a few rabbits. The forest had its usual calm, rustling leaves, distant bird calls, the crunch of twigs under my boots. I remember kneeling down next to one of my rabbit snares, which was located at the base of a fallen log. I noticed fresh tracks that looked promising. After resetting a snare or two, I spotted movement a few feet away, near a small burrow. I thought it might be a rabbit popping out, so I got my rifle ready. I waited, half hidden behind a bush, holding my breath as I saw the foliage shake. But it wasn't a rabbit. At first, I thought it was a badger, or maybe a groundhog. It was about that size. But as soon as it crawled into a patch of sunlight, I could see it was in some kind of horrible state of decay. Patches of fur were missing, and the skin underneath looked discolored, almost slimy. The smell hit me like a punch in the face, rotting flesh and something else I can't really describe. I'm used to the smell of dead animals, but this was worse, like it had been left out for days in the summer heat. Yet here it was, moving around like it was still alive. I froze for a second, trying to figure out what I was looking at. My mind was racing between, is this thing rabid, and should I just run? In the end, I decided to fire a warning shot, hoping to scare it off. It didn't flinch. It just kept crawling toward me, like it didn't even register the sound. I felt a sudden wave of dread, because I've never seen an animal ignore a gunshot like that. Usually, even a healthy predator would bolt at the noise. I raised my rifle again and aimed at it. This time, I shot to hit it, though I was aiming off-center, not wanting to entirely destroy the body in case it was diseased. The bullet definitely connected. I watched it make impact, but the creature barely reacted except for a slight jerk. It was as though it felt nothing. Normally, a wounded animal would either yelp, limp, or attempt to flee. This thing just kept crawling. It turned slightly, like it sensed me, but there was no real panic in its eyes. It felt more like a slow, mechanical movement, as though it was on autopilot. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I fired again, this time hitting it more squarely in what should have been the chest area. I saw fur and what looked like rotted flesh fly off. I expected it to drop, but it just staggered a bit and kept going. My stomach flipped when I realized I had shot this thing multiple times and it was still moving. It was more of a painful, dragging motion now, but forward nonetheless. The smell got even stronger and my eyes started watering. I shouted for my buddy, who was somewhere off to my right, maybe half a football field away, checking his own set of traps. I remember yelling his name twice, my voice cracking from a combination of fear and adrenaline. By the time he got close, I was still aiming at the creature, uncertain whether to put more rounds into it. I was borderline panicking at that point. He saw it too, this half-decayed, limp creature slowly making its way deeper into the trees. He asked, "What the hell is that?" Even though I don't think either of us really wanted an answer. We both watched it drag itself away, leaving a faint trail of dark fluid behind. It was some kind of blood, but it looked off. Thicker, maybe darker than usual. There was a moment where it turned its head, and I swear I saw empty eye sockets, as though whatever used to be in there was gone. Then it vanished behind a cluster of bushes. We decided we had to at least see if it was actually dying, or if it was going to keep going. We started following the blood trail, which was surprisingly minimal for something shot multiple times. There were a few splotches here and there, but it wasn't the steady trail you'd expect. In a few spots, it almost looked like the drops disappeared mid-leaf, like they got absorbed or just ended. We found a final smear near a large fallen branch, and that was it. No footprints, no more blood, nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed it up. The whole situation felt unreal. I've hunted all my life, and I've never seen anything keep moving like that after being shot so many times. I've also never come across an animal in such an advanced state of decomposition that was still alive, or, I guess, moving. We looked around for maybe 15 more minutes, calling out for each other to stay close, because neither of us felt comfortable splitting up again. But we found no sign of the creature, and it started feeling like we were intruding on something we shouldn't. The forest had gone really quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the breeze. It was dead silent. When we got back to our trucks, my buddy and I were both unnerved. We sat there a few minutes, just trying to process. We debated if we should tell someone, like a ranger, about a potentially rabid or diseased animal in the area. But we couldn't describe it without sounding insane. Zombie badger or rotting marmot wasn't exactly going to go over well. We also had no evidence besides our own eyewitness accounts. The only thing we had was a weird smell clinging to our clothes, which freaked me out even more. Later that day, after cleaning myself up and trying to calm down, I told a couple of local friends about what I saw. Their reactions were a mix of disbelief and morbid curiosity. One old-timer said he'd heard rumors of animals acting strange near Harper Forest, like not responding to injuries or having weird growths on their bodies. But nobody could give me a solid explanation. Some said it might be a parasite controlling the host. Others mentioned diseases that cause necrosis. And, of course, there were the jokes about forest zombies. The strangest part is how quickly everything went back to normal for me afterward. I mean, I kept hunting, though I was way more cautious. But I never saw anything like that again. I did start carrying a small camera with me, just in case. Not that I went looking for a repeat of that incident, but I figured if it ever happened again, I'd want proof I wasn't losing my mind. To this day, I can't fully explain what I witnessed. The best I can come up with is that it was an animal severely infected with something that numbed its pain and caused that grotesque decomposition-like appearance. Or maybe it was in the final stages of some freakish disease, though I've never seen or heard of one that lets a creature keep moving like that. I'll be honest, some nights I still see that thing in my mind's eye, dragging itself through the undergrowth, half its flesh missing, like some undead nightmare. I wish I could wrap this up with a definitive answer, or say I found tracks later, or that the ranger stations had a big investigation. But it just ended that day. After we lost sight of it, there was no more evidence it ever existed, aside from those few blood spatters that dried up and vanished. My friend and I eventually stopped telling people because the story sounded too out there. But I know what I saw. It wasn't natural, and it sure as hell wasn't something I ever want to encounter again. And that's really it. One day, one horrifying experience. Horrifying. Whatever that creature was, it disappeared just as quickly as it appeared, leaving me with nothing but memories that still send chills down my spine. I've been back to Harper Forest plenty of times since, but I've never felt entirely at ease there again. Something about that place changed for me, and I still can't shake the feeling that there's more in those woods than any of us realize. Story 20. I still remember that summer night like it happened yesterday. I was in my senior year of high school, and my friends and I were all looking for a bit of excitement before we scattered off to colleges or jobs. So when one of them suggested a late-night camping trip in a restricted section of a state park near Ellicott Mills, Maryland, we all jumped on it. There were 6 of us, me, my buddy Chris, his cousin Jen, and 3 other friends who basically lived for any sort of thrill. We knew we weren't supposed to camp there, but we figured it wouldn't hurt anyone. We had tents, a small cooler of cheap drinks, and a bunch of snacks we swiped from our parents' pantries. By the time we got to the clearing, it was already dusk. The trees around us were massive, their trunks thick with vines and moss. The air felt heavy, but not in a bad way, just like a normal summer evening. We picked a spot surrounded by towering oaks, well off the official trails. We were kind of proud of ourselves for finding such a hidden nook in the park. We set up 2 tents, gathered some wood, and made a small fire. Nothing too dramatic, just enough to roast marshmallows and keep ourselves warm. For a while, everything was awesome. We sat around talking about the most random stuff, college applications, dumb inside jokes from school, and gossip about people who weren't there. The sun went down fully around 9, and we kept going until about 11. That's when I noticed something was off. It started with the crickets and tree frogs falling silent. You know how in the woods at night there's usually this constant background of chirping or rustling? Well, it all just stopped. Even the breeze seemed to die down. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. Jen joked that it was the sign of some local forest ghost, but her voice sounded shaky. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe the animals had just shifted somewhere else. But then we all heard these heavy footsteps out in the dark. At first we thought it was a deer or maybe a bear. Though black bears are not super common around there, it's not impossible. The steps were slow and deliberate at first, like whatever it was didn't care about making noise. Then, all of a sudden, it sped up. It was like whoever or whatever was out there had locked onto our exact spot and was charging straight toward us. Branches snapped, leaves rustled in a frantic rhythm, and it was getting louder by the second. My heart practically jumped into my throat. Chris yelled, "Everyone get your flashlights!" But by the time we even scrambled to find them, we heard something crash through the brush just a few feet away. We couldn't see anything but shadows among the trees. That was it for our so-called bravery. We all bolted in different directions, panicked and stumbling over roots and stones. I remember my chest feeling tight and my lungs burning as I ran. I had never felt such raw fear in my life. It was almost like an instinct took over, and all I could think was, get away. After a few minutes of running, we managed to regroup near the path we'd come in on. That's when we realized we'd left all our stuff, tents, cooler, backpacks, back at the campsite. We agreed to run back real quick and grab our things. Big mistake. When we got there, it looked like a tornado had swept through. Our tents were slashed open, the cooler was tipped over, and everything we'd brought was either torn or scattered everywhere. We couldn't see any footprints that screamed bear or human. It was just chaos. Broken branches, leaves strewn around, and this lingering feeling that something was still watching us. Then, out of nowhere, this flurry of noise erupted from behind one of the tents. It sounded like snapping twigs, plus this weird guttural growl or moan. Honestly, it's hard to describe because I've never heard anything like it. Chris and another friend shouted, but I could barely hear them over my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Whatever was making that noise started moving toward us again, and we all panicked a second time. It was pure terror, like that fight-or-flight moment times 1,000. We took off, not even bothering to salvage anything except maybe a backpack or two that were still intact. We sprinted toward the dirt road that led to the small parking area. Every step I took, I half expected something to grab me from behind. At one point, I swear I felt a brush of air near my shoulder, like someone was right behind me. But when I turned around, there was nobody there, just darkness. We finally reached the car, nearly crashing into each other as we piled in. Chris had the keys, and his hands were shaking so much he dropped them twice before getting the engine started. The moment we peeled out of that place, I felt this weird mix of relief and dread. It was like we'd escaped for the moment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out. The next morning, we mustered enough courage to go back, partly because we wanted our stuff, and partly because I think some of us hoped it was just a crazy prank. We returned in broad daylight, and sure enough, the tents were in tatters, our cooler was cracked, and there were random items flung all over. But the strangest part, there weren't any clear prints or identifiable tracks, just broken branches and chunks of dirt that looked like they'd been clawed or kicked up. It was like something went berserk there, but left no proof of what it was. We asked around a little, and some people said that local troublemakers sometimes mess with overnight campers to scare them away. Others told us stories about a forest guardian, or some creature that supposedly roams the woods at night, pushing people out if they camp where they're not allowed. None of us knew what to believe. All I know is that we weren't imagining the terror we felt. We didn't even need to say it out loud. We all knew it was more than some bored kids playing pranks. A few weeks later, I went back to the park alone in the middle of the day, just to see if I could pick up the trail and quell that gnawing fear in my gut. Walking along the same paths we had sprinted down at night, I felt this odd sense of calm. The woods seemed perfectly normal, peaceful even. It almost made me question my own memories, but I still got goosebumps when I stood in that clearing. The place looked so innocent under the sunlight, but I couldn't shake the echo of the terror from that night. The difference was almost unreal. like two different worlds, daytime calm and nighttime horror. I never found a real explanation. To this day, my friends and I have our own theories. Maybe it was a group of locals, maybe an actual animal, or maybe something we can't explain. A couple of them refused to ever go camping again. I've gone on a few trips since, but I'm way more cautious now. I always research the area, stick to the rules, and keep my wits about me. There's a line between seeking a thrill and being plain reckless, and I learned that lesson the hard way. Some nights I still dream about those footsteps rushing toward us, and I wake up sweating, convinced I can hear that same eerie silence in my room. It's like that night never truly left me. The strangest part is that it never happened again. No weird news stories, no more talk of campers being chased. It was like that one night was special in some terrifying way, a one-time event that no one can fully explain. I still don't have any answers, and that feeling of not knowing might be the worst part. But for what it's worth, I've never looked at a quiet forest the same way again.